Chapter 1. The scent of apple turnovers hung in the air along with the faintest hint of cooler weather. It wasn't much, not like further north where the seasons changed, but sometimes going from almost 90 to the mid-80s felt like a shift. Then again, for someone who had grown up in New York like Eva Stewart, the change was almost too subtle to notice. Still, the instinct to decorate for fall was still there, even if the warmer Key West weather had wrestled some of it into submission. One of her guests sat on the opposite end of the front porch, paper held in front of his face, and inside the large front window she spotted several other guests chatting in the seating areas. She loved to see that. It was one of the reasons she hadn't expanded her lucrative and usually booked bed and breakfast business to multiple locations. She didn't want to miss the cozy feeling of connection one got when traveling to B&Bs. "One last turnover and your name is on it." Anton, the chef of the Keys bed and breakfast, grinned up at her. He was holding a plate with a delicious-looking turnover. Careful to attach the last string of candy corn lights before climbing down from the stepladder, Eva smiled up at the man. "I really shouldn't." He scoffed at her. "No one can resist Anton's turnovers." Eva smiled at the way Anton always referred to himself in the third person. He was a fun chef to have around and quite talented as well. "That's the truth," she said, laughing. Mission accomplished, Anton spun around to head back inside, but she called out for him to stop. "Where are we on the Halloween brunch?" "It's coming along," he said, nodding his head enthusiastically. "Jake's got the reservation site ready to go for the 2-week mark." Ever since he'd started working at the Keys, Anton had suggested they open up the breakfast room for Saturday brunches. She turned him down initially, unsure how it would play out to her guests who came for the somewhat secluded atmosphere of the bed and breakfast, but he kept bringing it up and finally wore her down. When they opened for brunch on the first Saturday in August, the response had been overwhelming. The reservations were booked within hours, and the meal itself had been a delight. Her guests, whom she'd been most worried about, had thought it was a wonderful opportunity, and those who preferred not to be a part of it had taken their breakfast earlier that day. Now, Anton was pushing for brunch on Sundays as well, and she'd relented, but only for the fact that a Halloween brunch sounded delightful. She wasn't sure that she wanted it to be an every weekend type of thing, but for this month, she'd agreed to one weekend with a Saturday and Sunday brunch. "Good, I just want to make sure that we're prepared, and—" "You have nothing to worry about, Ms. S." He didn't know the meaning of worry. "Anton will take care of everything." "I'm sure you will," she said, and watched as he headed back inside. For as much amazing food as the man cooked, she didn't know how it was possible to be so physically fit. She shook her head and turned back to the porch. A few years back, she had purchased artificial pumpkins, which she now arranged on the porch along with some other harvest decorations. She didn't like to go full-on Halloween like some houses did, since ghosts weren't her preference, but she did like to decorate with a few seasonal odds and ends. While Eva had lived in Key West for 6 years, she still couldn't put her New York roots completely behind her. This was the time of year when she missed the change of seasons most of all, though she had to admit that being able to go to the beach at any time was a luxury she enjoyed. "Isn't this looking quaint?" a woman's voice said behind Eva. She spun around and saw the grinning face of Geraldine, her friend and co-member of the Murder Mystery Book Club, or MMBC. It was a group Eva hosted every Friday night at the bed and breakfast. "Geraldine, what are you doing here?" Dressed elegantly, if not a little eccentrically as usual, Geraldine wore a vibrant orange and gold kimono over a black shift dress. Her gold boat shoes and gold head wrap perfectly matched the accents of her black and gold purse. In her early 70s, she'd been in Key West most of her life, and though now widowed, she spent a great deal of time reading mysteries. She was the perfect addition to the MMBC, but also a good friend. "I just went to the pop-up antique fair happening over at Mallory Square. They're hosting it for the next few weeks, and it's a treasure trove of glorious things." "You didn't buy more furniture, did you?" Eva placed a few cornstalks against the porch support post and began to tie it up with thin wire. "I was tempted," Geraldine admitted, letting out a dramatic sigh. "But I heard your voice in my head saying, 'But where will you put it?'" Eva laughed. "Then I've done my job." "But—" The hesitation in Geraldine's voice drew Eva's attention from the cornstalks. "There is something I wanted to show you." "All right, just give me one moment here." She twisted off the wire and stood back to admire her handiwork. The stalks held up and were shielded by the roof, so they wouldn't get wet if any rain came. "Looks good," Geraldine said, coming up the steps and joining Eva in a small seating area to the left of the door. The print on the cushions was a bold and bright palm leaf that was set against a light blue background with coordinating pillows in green and blue. It was one of Eva's favorite seating arrangements she'd put together. "What is it?" Eva asked. Geraldine hauled her oversized purse onto the coffee table and started rummaging through it. "I found something." While Eva waited, her attention caught on the guest on the other side of the porch. He seemed to be watching Geraldine. She searched her memory for the man's name. Mr. Anderson. Abe Anderson. She'd mentioned liking the alliteration, but he'd seemed the type of guest who wanted to keep to himself. While he'd said, rather begrudgingly, that he was here for a convention, he hadn't expanded on what it was about, so she'd stopped pressing. Still, she was certain he couldn't be interested in anything Geraldine had found at an antique swap meet. Perhaps he was just nosy. "What is it, Geraldine?" She pulled her attention back to her friend's purse and pulled out a beautiful, polished hardwood box. It had intricate details on the top, different colored woods pieced together to create a pattern, and was roughly 8 inches by 5 inches. Eva thought she heard a gasp coming from Mr. Anderson's side of the porch, but when she looked, his paper was back up. Turning back to the box, she admired it. "That's beautiful. I thought so too," her friend said, running a hand across the top of the box. "But what's in the box really caught my attention." Eva felt a shiver of anticipation at her friend's words. "What does that mean?" Geraldine opened the box to show an empty interior with a red felt bottom. "So, nothing? That's what has your interest? Is this a metaphor for life or something?" "No," Geraldine chuckled. "Look." She reached in and, using a long acrylic nail also painted with gold and black, she tugged up the corner of the felt. It came up easily to reveal a small indentation. Geraldine stuck her nail into the indent and pulled. The bottom came away easily and revealed a folded piece of paper that looked yellowed with age. "How did you find that?" Eva said, impressed by her friend's discovery. "A bit of luck, a bit of mystery book reading." "What does that mean?" Eva said with a laugh. "When you've read as many mysteries as I have, you start to get curious at even the smallest things." "You couldn't just let it be a box?" Eva said, slumping back against the pillows and chair cushion. "You know I couldn't." "Well, what is it?" Eva couldn't help her own anticipation at the thought of finding an old piece of paper at the bottom of a secret compartment. "I'm not fully sure," she said, reaching into the box and pulling out the map. Geraldine glanced around, her focus stalling on Mr. Anderson. When Eva looked over, the man looked over at them again, but once caught, he quickly turned back to his paper. That was odd. Then again, she would have been as curious as he was, Eva surmised. Geraldine maneuvered her back to the man. "It doesn't make sense." She opened the paper, and Eva's eyes widened. Geraldine hadn't just found a paper in a box. She'd found a treasure map. "Where should I put these, Dulcura?" Eva blinked back at Ruben Vargas, her friend and contractor. "Over there is fine." She pointed to a corner of the front porch in front of her guest, Mr. Anderson. He was still reading, but had shifted from the paper to a novel about Hemingway. Ruben hefted the large bale of hay she had asked him to procure for her. He had 3, 1 for the smaller side of the porch and 2 for the other. He hefted them exactly where she wanted them, and then dusted off his hands. "Thank you, that looks perfect." Her eyes took in the scene and saw that it was what she wanted, but her mind was elsewhere. "Are you all right, Eva?" Ruben said, taking off his white straw hat and wiping his brow before putting it back on over his black hair. "Yes, I'm fine," she said, smiling back. And she was, but she was also preoccupied. It wasn't every day that your friend showed you what certainly seemed to be a treasure map. She and Geraldine had pored over it, looking for any familiar markings, but nothing seemed right. Eva had even taken out her phone to do a search, but without the direction of the map, they didn't even know how to read it. Geraldine had entrusted the map to Eva, knowing that the bed and breakfast had a safe, but Eva desperately wanted to pull it out and study it again. Unfortunately, she'd promised Geraldine she'd wait until the woman could join her. "Fine, yes, but good?" "I think not." "You're thinking about something, see?" "Perhaps, but nothing important." He held her gaze a little longer, then nodded. "Let me get the plans." He headed back to his truck parked in the alley next to the bed and breakfast. The same alley where a body had been found, which started her friendship with the handsome Detective Jerome Makos. The same detective she hadn't seen in weeks. Sighing, she watched Ruben rummage around his large truck. She'd known him almost as long as she'd lived in Key West. He had done the renovation and remodeling of the Victorian home she'd purchased to make the Keys bed and breakfast. Then she'd hired him to build a small cottage in the back so she could have her own living space while reserving the bulk of the bed and breakfast for her guests. Now he was here to talk about the remodeling of a room she'd been begging him to work on. They had a friendly joke going back and forth about how he didn't want her to redecorate it. He'd even made a bargain with her that if she went to a cabaret show with him, something she disliked, he would talk to her about the room. It was all in jest, of course, but she was ready to spruce up the White Room, and Ruben wasn't getting out of it now. Still, the thought of finding more information about the map was so tempting. Ruben had shown up, and Geraldine had left quickly, but they'd agreed to talk about it more soon. "Pardon." The deep voice of a man behind her startled Eva. "I'm sorry, Mr. Anderson," she said, realizing she'd slipped into her thoughts yet again and had stopped in the middle of the porch. Her gaze landed on a pin on his lapel. "What's that?" She pointed to it, and he took a step back as if she'd slapped him. Nothing." He moved to step past her, but she examined the pin a moment longer. It was in the shape of an old-fashioned magnifying glass and made out of what she assumed was bronze or a metal composite. Mr. Anderson rushed toward the front door, and Eva wondered if she'd said something offensive, but he had been standoffish from the start and even acting oddly that morning, so she decided not to take his actions to heart. As she watched, he immediately pulled out a cell phone and placed a call. The look he sent over his shoulder made her look away, and she couldn't help but think he was acting strange. "Now, are you ready to look at the plans?" Ruben said. "Yes," she said, putting on a bright smile. She'd been wanting this for months, and yet Ruben always had something come up. She'd warned him she might go with another company if it meant getting things done faster, but he'd assured her he wanted to do it. They sat back down at the same seating area she'd shared with Geraldine, and he pulled out plans for the remodel. What she didn't tell him was that she'd never been happy with the way the White Room had turned out in the first place. It wasn't his fault. She just hadn't had a good vision. "And you're moving that wall I mentioned?" she said, after he'd pointed out the cosmetic choices his designer had suggested. "See, but it will be quite the job, Dulcura." "I know, but I think it's worth it for the addition of the soaker tub." She pointed on the design layout. "See, this place here was underused and stealing a small portion of the already large closet and sitting area. Making the change will give us an even bigger bathroom." "And you are sure about tan?" He said it with a bit of a sneer. She rolled her eyes. "I know it's not white, but we'll still have plenty of that to offset the beige color. I don't want to go monochromatic." Now she was the one to make a face. "But I think the white is too stark. It needs the softening of a creamier color palette. Think soft greens, beige, and white. But we'll call it the tan room, yes." "All right," he said with a sigh. "If that is what you want, that is what you shall get. When will you be able to start?" She caught the way he averted her gaze and kept his eyes on the plans he was rolling up. "Soon. Yes, very soon. Ruben!" He stood and started to walk off, but she followed after him. "What does very soon mean?" He paused at the base of the stairs to look back at her, an apology in his soft brown eyes. "I'm sorry. I had a special contract come up that I had to take, but I will get you on the schedule as soon as possible, I promise." "But how soon?" she asked again as he rushed out of her yard. Sighing, she tossed her hands up. It wasn't a crucial remodel. She could still rent out the room because it was a very nice space, but she was anxious to get it under construction. There was really no other reason but the fact that she didn't like unfinished projects. Unfortunately, Ruben's company was busy. Again. She hoped it was only that, not his odd affinity to the room that kept him from wanting to work on her B&B. Looking at the porch, she saw a few spots where more decorations could go, and decided to focus the rest of her morning on that. Then, in preparation for the next Murder Mystery Book Club meeting, she needed to finish Strong Poison by Dorothy L. Sayers, the book where Lord Peter Wimsey begins to fall in love with Harriet Vane after she was accused of murdering her fiancé. It would be a semi-relaxed sort of day, but in the back of her mind, Eva knew she would be mulling over the map that Geraldine had entrusted to her care. There was something there, Eva was certain of it, but their sleuthing would have to wait in pursuit of other things like business and mystery reading. At least until Geraldine could come over again. Chapter 2. But it's a classic. Willard Smith wiped a thin ring of lemonade from his upper lip, the powdered sugar from his beignet falling like snow onto his knee. Sayers is the pinnacle writer of British crime. I'm not arguing that, Pete Jenkins said, sending his wife Kay a look. I'm just saying I wasn't as impressed. She's no A.C. George. No one is A.C. George but A.C. George, Willard said. His full cheeks were flushed and he looked in danger of exploding. I had no idea you were quite so fond of Sayers, Willard, Geraldine said. She looked at him over her half-moon reading glasses. I read her books with my mother when I was a teen. They mean a lot to me. Eva watched the exchange with the mild fascination of a referee not sure whether to step into the ring or not. While it was her job to facilitate discussion for the book club, this was getting into dangerously personal territory. So, she said, drawing everyone's attention back to her, let's call this a case closed. She used their term for when a discussion was getting out of hand. We'll start back next week with a new-to-our-group author, Nev March, and her novel Murder in Old Bombay. You asked for a historical read, she sent a pointed look to Willard. This seems to me just that. Still looking perturbed, Willard merely grunted and reached for another beignet. Eva was tempted to tell him not to take it, knowing that his wife Bonnie would not be happy, since it conflicted with his diet, but he still looked hurt from earlier comments. Granted, those comments had been harmless and merely opinion, but Willard was known to take things a little too personally at times. Has anyone heard from Elijah? Kay asked, looking around their smaller group. Both he and her friend Dr. Vicky Clem, the Key West medical examiner, were away from the group, which drastically affected the discussions. I did earlier today, Eva said. He said things are going well and he hopes to be back with us for next week's meeting. I've sent him the book information as well. Oh, good, Kay said, her smile beaming. Ever since his art installation, he's been so busy, so popular. I'm glad his art, both modern and impressionist, are taking off as well, Eva agreed. While Elijah Tang had been a popular modern artist in San Francisco, he'd left behind his fame to come to Key West and explore a new type of art. Some of his fans had been less than pleased, but he seemed to be winning them over. And Vicky? Pete said. Busy with work again, Eva said. Vicky had missed several meetings in the last few weeks due to an overabundance of work as a medical examiner. Plus, she'd been guest lecturing at conferences. Eva had all but begged her to plan a movie night so they could catch up, but they had yet to nail down a date. Well, it's time for us to be heading home, Kay said. She and Pete ran a doggy daycare and grooming business and usually had animals of all sorts with them. Tonight, they hadn't brought a four-legged friend to the meeting, but that was rare. See you all later, Willard said, turning to go. He still seemed dejected, but Eva wasn't so sure it was all about the meeting. Something was up with him, and while she wanted to stop him and ask, she knew he would only open up when he was ready. Geraldine, who had been unusually quiet during their discussion, turned to Eva with sparkling eyes when they were alone on the porch. Well, what? She said. Well, what have you discovered about the map? Nothing, she said honestly. Nothing? What? Eva smiled at Geraldine's reaction. I've been waiting to go over it with you. I didn't want to overstep. It is your find. Oh, pish. She tossed her hands up. I left it here, hoping you'd just call and tell me that you'd figured it all out. Eva laughed, knowing that wasn't fully what Geraldine believed. I did have an idea, but you'll have to come with me. Do tell. Geraldine crossed her legs, fingers lacing over her knee. I found a map man. A map man? Geraldine looked confused. Well, it's more that Elijah has a map man, and I think we need to go see him. He knows maps, I assume. Yes. Apparently, Elijah met him at a local artist meetup. He studies antique maps, but is also a cartographer himself, making maps for books and things like that. How exciting. Without telling Elijah what I was looking into, he was able to suggest this man. I called, and despite the fact that tomorrow is Saturday, he's willing to meet with us at his office. Geraldine clapped her hands together. This is wonderful. Should we look at it now? Eva considered bringing the map out of the safe that sat hidden behind a painting in the main room of the bed and breakfast, but it was getting late, and she was tired from an early morning. How about tomorrow? Perhaps after he looks it over? We can discuss it all." "Sounds lovely," Geraldine said. Taking Ava's cue that they were done for the evening, she stood and pulled her silk scarf over her shoulders, acting like a shawl. It wasn't cold, but it was a little cooler than when she'd arrived. "I'll see you tomorrow, then?" Eva said, walking her to the front door. "Yes, dear. Say 1 o'clock? Perfect." Eva watched the older woman reach the street, where she hailed a cab like the Key West native that she was. Eva smiled and then turned back to the task of cleaning up after book club and locking all of the doors to the bed and breakfast. When all was locked up tight, she retreated to her small cottage. Upon opening the door, she was met with the sight of her gas fireplace, cozy couch, and small eat-in nook, as well as the kitchen. Her bedroom and master bath was off to the right, and that completed the cottage itself. While not large, it was exactly what she needed, and she saw the space as her haven. An hour later, Eva was almost ready for bed. She'd picked up the next MMBC novel, Murder in Old Bombay, and soon found herself fully immersed in British India and Captain Jim Agnihotri's investigation. She was battling her eyelids closing when a loud alarm rent the air. Dropping the book in her fright, Eva jumped to her feet, slipping into her sandals and grabbing a silk robe to cover up her pajama top and shorts. Heart pounding and phone in hand, Eva made her way to the front door, opening it just enough to see out into the darkness of the pool area. Nothing moved, though the alarm sound was louder. It was coming from the bed and breakfast. The next moment, her phone rang. It was the alarm company calling to make sure things were all right. She had no idea and agreed for them to send a police cruiser to check things out. While it was in her nature to investigate, she also knew better than to put herself in a dangerous situation. Instead, Eva closed the door and locked it, waiting until a knock signaled the officer was there. Less than 10 minutes later, she heard a police car pull up. "Let's go take a look, Miss Stewart," the young man said. She recognized him from a former case, an Officer Kent, she thought. He looked to be in his 30s with broad shoulders, sandy blonde hair, and a kind smile. He asked basic questions. Had she heard anything? Did she notice anything broken? But she had to answer no to it all. Being back in the cottage was delightful, but it also meant that she was removed from the main house. When they entered the bed and breakfast from the backyard door, she saw some of her braver guests in the hall looking out to see what was wrong. Officer Kent quickly assured them that everything was under control and that they should go back to bed. She was glad he took the initiative because she was too busy looking around the main room. It was divided in half by a thick row of potted plants, ensuring that there were multiple seating areas. At the opposite side of the room was the breakfast area and kitchen, but before that was the cage for her Amazon parrot, Poirot. She rushed to him, but he looked mostly unfazed. "Call the cops," he said, head bobbing up and down. "They're here already, Poirot. Aren't you a smart bird?" More bobbing. Pretty bird gets a treat." While normally she wouldn't feed him a treat this late, she could tell a few signs of agitation and hoped a treat might help. "Here you are," she said as she handed him a cracker. "Pretty bird." "Yes, a very pretty bird indeed." Miss Stewart," the officer said behind her. "Sorry, just making sure he was all right." "Of course. Do you see any sign of break-in or anything missing?" Refocusing her attention on the room, she made a quick walk around. The doors appeared secure and nothing was missing. "Nothing that I can see so far," she said. But as she circled back to the front desk, her steps faltered. The painting she'd hung to hide the safe access was crooked. She went to it and moved it away from the safe. While it was still locked, and she was positive no one could get in, it was odd that the painting had been touched, for surely nothing else could explain that. Her gaze traveled over everything near the area. As she examined each nook and cranny, there was nothing to see but... Her gaze snagged on a small pin. It was in the shape of a magnifying glass. "Anything, Miss Stewart?" She was about to point out the pin, but then she stopped herself. Yes, the painting was shifted, but that didn't mean someone had moved it. Perhaps whoever was in the room had somehow knocked into the wall and shifted the painting? Or maybe one of the staff had come too close and shifted it. She couldn't say with certainty that it hadn't been that way when she locked the doors that night. But the alarm. It wasn't clear why the alarm had gone off and nothing was missing. Instead of ratting out one of her guests who could have lost the pin at any time, she decided to keep that small piece of information to herself. "No," she said, turning a smile back to the officer. "I can't see anything. Thank you so much for coming by." "Of course," he said, dipping his head. "Call again if you need anything." She walked him to the door, undid the alarm, and let him out. She reset the alarm and went back to her cottage. It was an odd happenstance, but alarms went off all the time. She'd review the security footage tomorrow with Jake and let that be that. "And you don't see anything?" she asked him. Jake Brown, her resident tech guru, reviewed footage from the night before. "Nothing out of the ordinary, though you could make a case that this shadow here," he pointed to the screen, "that could be someone. But it could also be the wind or a random shadow from the camera." Eva frowned. She'd had the cameras installed after her bed and breakfast had been broken into, more than once, and Ruben had assured her that the cameras would do their job. How was it that they didn't even cover the very sensitive area of the safe? "Is it possible they were moved?" she asked, stating what she'd been thinking. I was thinking that too." Jake scratched at his chin. "I don't often review the recordings, but I did think that it was covering more of the safe than that." As they were watching the playback, suddenly the painting shifted, tilting at an angle. "Did you see that?" "I did." Jake paused it, reversed the recording, and came back to it, but there was nothing more than the shift to see. "Should I send this over to the officer here last night?" "No." Ava's head tilted to the side as she considered what she'd found. While she hadn't touched it with her fingers, she'd picked up the pin with the plastic bag after Officer Kent left. Perhaps now was the time to talk to her guest. "I'll take care of it. Thanks for all your hard work, Jake." "Sure thing, Eva." He pulled out a textbook and flipped it open, likely to work on his homework, and she stepped away from the desk. It was nearing 11, and she'd agreed to meet with Geraldine to talk to Elijah's map guy just after lunch. It meant she had plenty of time until her friend would expect her. Channeling what confidence she could from what she'd seen on the tape, she made her way down the hall toward Mr. Anderson's door. After knocking several times and not receiving an answer, she paused with her fist in front of the door. Was it possible he'd left? She turned to make a quick stop back with Jake and found that his room did show a logout at 9 that morning. She'd missed her opportunity to meet with him, but that didn't mean that she was going to give up. Eva took a little time to talk to Poirot, and then she decided to see if Geraldine would want to get lunch before they made their appointment. When she agreed, Eva left and they went to lunch at one of her favorite salad places. Finally, as the time of their appointment drew near, the women took a taxi over to the map man, as Elijah had called him. The cab pulled up in front of a small, eclectic-looking shop that boasted a few odd statues out front and a sign over the door that said Map Man Antiques. "He calls himself the Map Man?" Geraldine said, climbing out of the cab. "Yes, he's a bit of an odd duck, but he's very knowledgeable." Geraldine nodded, then asked, "You have the box, right?" Eva wanted to laugh and ask Geraldine why she'd chosen now to ask about it, but instead she patted her shoulder bag. "I've got it all right in here." "Good. I'm excited to see what he'll think of it." "As am I." They ascended the steps and Eva pulled open the door for them. Inside, a long, narrow hallway was created by stacks of antique items, boxes overflowing with books, and a thick rug leading the way toward a more open space. When they turned into that space, Eva saw a man sitting behind a large oak desk. He had spectacles on and was leaning over a large map faded by time. Geraldine cleared her throat, but the man didn't move. Then she said, "Map man," in a tone that said, "Don't keep us waiting, please." Eva nearly laughed, but managed to curb it. He jerked back from what he was doing and looked at them in turn, his eyes magnified by the glasses. Suddenly he yanked the wire rims from his nose and squinted. "Can I help you?" "Hello, I'm Eva, Elijah's friend." "Ah, yes, we met once?" He pulled off his glasses and attempted to put them in a non-existent breast pocket before setting them on the table. "Yes. How are you, Caleb?" Shoving away from the desk, he came to shake her hand and Geraldine's in turn. "Doing well," he said, running a hand through unruly hair the color of straw. "Been busy. Always seems to be this time of year." "Do you have time to look at my friend's find?" she asked. "Always have time for a friend of Elijah's," he said with a boyish grin. Geraldine took the box from Eva and handed it to Caleb. He lost all interest in everything else and brought it to his table after carefully clearing away the map he'd been working on when they arrived. He opened the box, examining each angle of it with great care, and then he followed Geraldine's instructions to remove the bottom. Eva smiled as he wiggled his fingers over the map inside before he gingerly picked it out of the box. "This is a beauty. Where did you find it?" "The pop-up market, if you can believe it. Someone mentioned Hemingway." At this, Caleb's head jerked up. "What?" "I don't put much stock in it," she said, though Eva detected the hint of hope in her friend's words. "But that's why I brought it to you." "I think you may have something here," he finally said, looking up from his study of the map. Eva had taken to perusing the room and had found all manner of odd things, but this news was better than any I Love Lucy memorabilia or signed copy of a little-known classical poet. "What do you mean?" Eva asked. He didn't even bother looking at her, his expression one of wonder and focused solely on the map itself. "I think this is a period map. You can tell by the way the ink has faded and by the texture of the paper." He had put on gloves, but now removed one to run a gentle finger along the edge of the page. Not enough to damage it, but enough to feel its texture. "I'd say it dates back to—" Ava's phone went off in the quiet of the shop, and she yanked her bag open to find it. "Sorry," she said, motioning that she take it in the hall. When she finally found it in the recess of her purse, the call showed it was someone from the B&B calling. "Hello?" she said, slightly out of breath. "Eva?" She could tell instantly that it was Benita and that something was wrong. "Yes, it's me, Benita. What's wrong?" "There's—" She gasped for a breath. "Elena found a—" She paused again, as if needing to force herself to say the next part. "What is it?" "There's a dead body in the grey room." Chapter 3. There was indeed a dead body in the grey room. Eva could barely believe that she was now facing the door to the same room she'd pounded on earlier that morning. Mr. Anderson's room. All around her, chaos ensued, but she was focused on the fact that Mr. Anderson hadn't answered her earlier that morning because he was dead. Well, she was guessing that had been the case, but it was entirely possible that he had come back from wherever he'd been and then had passed. Either way, it was sad and a bit creepy. "How you doing?" Jerome said, coming up to her with his customary notepad and pen. "Why are you here?" she blurted out before pressing her lips closed. "I'm sorry. That came out wrong. I just mean—" "Wait, don't tell me this is a homicide." He offered her a compassionate look, and with some surprise, she realized she'd missed him. Ever since the last case she'd helped him solve, he'd given her a bit of an ultimatum. In fact, it was more of a condition. She'd attempted to bargain for her and the MMBC to be somewhat involved in helping the detective solve crimes, but he'd countered with a condition. If she applied to get her private investigator's license in Florida, he'd allow it. At first, she'd considered that perhaps he was just trying to make it hard on her to help him. Maybe he didn't think he needed the help. All the evidence to the contrary. But the more she thought about it, she came to the conclusion that he had her best interests at heart. She'd shared with him about how her Uncle Sal, a private investigator, had brought her along for the ride when he'd gone out to investigate. She'd been enthralled and had considered becoming a PI, but hadn't taken the plunge. While that should have changed her attitude regarding his condition, it hadn't. Perhaps it was that she didn't like being put in a corner, or perhaps she resented the feeling of meddling. But either way, she wasn't sure she was ready for PI status, and she didn't want that to stop her from helping when a case presented itself. Then again, she hadn't expected something to come up so quickly. But there was no evidence to say that Mr. Anderson had been murdered, right? "I'm just here to help with the crime scene while Vicky's busy on another call. No foul play suspected. Unless there's something I should know." She opened her mouth to say there wasn't, but closed it after she remembered finding the pin. She'd planned on confronting the man about it and asking him whether he'd been in the main area late that night, perhaps near the safe, but she had very little evidence to go on. Eva. Jerome always found a way to read her, even when she didn't say anything. She hesitated, and then spent the next few minutes filling him in on what she'd discovered. Honestly, I don't think he was involved in anything truly suspicious. Nothing points to that, really, but it was odd. I'll note that in my report. But you're right, the death itself doesn't appear odd. It seems that he died of natural causes. Of course, we'll need an autopsy to back that up. Of course. She looked over his shoulder through the open door to the man's rented room. You want to look around in there, don't you? His narrowed-eyed look told her he was amused, but also a little curious as to what she thought she might find. To be honest, she was curious herself. Why she had the desire to go into the room she couldn't say, but she had a feeling it could prove to be useful. Or it could prove nothing at all. Either way, what could it hurt? She looked back at Jerome and nodded, but she wouldn't beg. No way, no how. "Come on, then," he said, stepping in and gesturing for her to follow. "What can it hurt?" She desperately wanted to give him a hard time and remind him that she hadn't started her courses yet, that she wasn't even sure she wanted to become a PI, but she held her tongue. Why ruin a good thing? She'd gotten what she wanted, and she wasn't going to risk him changing his mind now. They stepped into the gray room. 3 walls were painted a muted gray color, with the accent wall in a bright white with a ridged texture almost like plaster. The hardware was all gold, the bedding was white, and the floor was a slate gray tile that looked like wood. A brilliant jewel-blue chase lounge was under the window. It was an eclectic room, and yet she found both men and women enjoyed it. It was most often requested by men traveling alone or on business. There was something about the subdued tones, if she were to guess. As you can see, Jerome said, indicating the body on the bed that was now being tended to by 2 ME techs. It seems he died peacefully. She avoided looking too long. A glance was more than sufficient, and then turned her perusal to the room itself. Everything looked in order. A black hardtop suitcase was open on the luggage rack. There was a jacket and an extra pair of shoes in the closet, and by the bed. Her gaze landed to the book on the nightstand. Hemingway, The Man and His Treasure. Next to that was the end of a phone charging cord. Was his phone found on him? She asked. Jerome consulted the text, but she could tell that they all said no by their headshakes. Doesn't look like he had one. But the cord, she said, indicating the bedside table. Could be for another type of device. I'll look into it, though. Your staff wouldn't have... He pressed his lips together, as if realizing he was walking into dangerous territory. They wouldn't have removed it, would they? Absolutely not. My staff wouldn't have touched a thing in this room once the body was found. You can count on that. She knew he was insinuating that one of her employees could have stolen the phone, but she knew she could trust them no matter what. Right, I assumed as much. She wanted to press and say he likely didn't, but it was a moot point now. So perhaps something is missing, or it was left by a previous guest? We clean these rooms thoroughly. Nothing is overlooked, especially not something as obvious as that. Jerome held up his free hand. Don't take offense. I'm just spitballing here. Eva nodded. He was just doing his job, she knew that, but it was certainly not comfortable to think of her employees like common criminals. She finished looking around the room, careful not to touch anything, and then they stepped back into the hall. Several guests were lined up, and Eva quickly assured them that everything was fine and that someone had had an accident. It felt like a lie coming off her tongue, but it was the best and only way to explain the police. She'd update them as soon as she knew more. When they were alone again, Jerome turned to her. It's been a while since I've seen you, Eva. She met his gaze with a solemn nod. It has. Have you considered my condition? Somehow she'd known he was going to broach the topic, but she wasn't ready to give him a hard and fast answer. I have, she shrugged. I haven't made a decision yet. I can respect that, he said, flipping his notebook closed. I was just thinking that if... I'm here! A sing-song voice floated from the front room moments before Dr. Vicky Clem popped around the corner. She wore a bright floral print A-line dress with shiny black heels. She was the best-dressed medical examiner Eva had ever seen. Then again, she didn't know many in that line of work. I thought you were busy, Jerome said. I was, but finished up early. I decided to come straight here. I thought, either there's a dead body for me, or I can take Eva to lunch. I'm happy to see I come in second to a dead body, Eva quipped. Vicky grinned, her dark red lipstick making her lips shimmer. Now show me to the body. Natural causes. Vicky stood up and yanked off a pair of latex gloves. I'm not going to stake my life on it, she continued, but if I were a betting woman, I'd place money on it. That's only helpful if I know what kind of risk you're willing to take, Jerome said, looking between Vicky and Eva as they stood in the main lobby of the bed and breakfast. Risky business, Poirot said from his cage in the corner. Eva smiled. I don't know who taught him that one, but it's a new favorite. Basically, we have to wait for your report, Jerome said, shuffling his feet back and forth, his gaze on the parrot in the cage. Basically? I already knew that, he said with a chuckle. But that's why they pay me the big bucks. Vicky picked up her black Gucci bag and slung it over her shoulder. I'll be back tonight. Did we say 6 or 6:30, Eva? Jerome looked between them like he'd missed something. I think it was 6. Okay, perfect. Bye. Eva watched her friend leave without so much as a backward glance. Vicky sure was fun. She marched to the beat of her own drum, and that often looked like someone who did things on a whim. At other times, she was hyper-methodical, but that usually came out in her work and less in her personal life. What's tonight? Jerome asked. Eva had made her way to Poirot's cage and was getting ready to feed him a treat. "We're having a movie night."
"Girls just want to have fun,"
Poirot said. Jerome chuckled. "This guy has a lot of great movie quotes, don't you, Poirot?"
"Pretty bird. Pretty bird gets a cracker."
"No cracker this time," Eva said. "He's been having too many of them," she clarified to Jerome. "But I'll give you a few almonds."
"Pretty bird."
Smiling, she held out the treat for the bird to take. Then she offered one to Jerome, and after making Poirot shake his wing, Jerome offered the bird an almond. "He's very intelligent, isn't he?" "He is," she admitted. "If only he could tell me who was near the safe last night." "What?" Eva blushed. She'd told Jerome about the alarm going off and how she'd found what she believed to be Mr. Anderson's pin, but she'd failed to mention the shifted frame. She did so now, filling him in on the rest. "You should have told me about that sooner," he said, reaching for his notebook. She stayed him by placing her hand on his arm. "It's not a big deal. The safe wasn't open, no one was on the tape, and everything was untouched inside. What would I have said? Guess what? No one broke into our safe last night?" He smiled, shaking his head. "Okay, I see your point. Still, it could be relevant. You find a pin, a painting is shifted, and then the owner of that very pin winds up dead in your bed and breakfast?" She gave him a slow nod. "I'll admit, it sounds suspicious." "You can say that again." This time she let him pull the notepad free and watched as he scribbled information down. She had no idea what he could be writing, but she'd seen the way his mind worked, and she had to admit he was very good at his job. Jerome offered the bird another almond and then dusted off his fingers. "I'd better get back to the station. I've got some extra paperwork to fill out." He turned to face her, his green eyes flashing in the dim afternoon light. "But don't cut me off." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm beginning to think my brilliant plan to have you join me in the field of investigation, albeit in a different vein than police work, may be backfiring." "How's that?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "You haven't said one thing to me about the PI business, and I haven't seen you in 3 weeks. Granted, there have been no dead bodies, but is that what it takes for me to see you?" A surprising warmth flooded the pit of her stomach, but she pushed the fluttering feelings aside. "I told you I'm considering what you suggested." "I see." He looked down, the toe of his leather shoe digging against the tile floor. "Well, when you decide, let me know." "I will." An awkward silence descended, and Eva wished she had more to say. She liked Jerome, liked his direct manner and the way he approached his job. But she also didn't know him that well. She'd invited him to their murder mystery book club once, and while he'd attended that week, he'd never returned, even though it was clear he'd enjoyed his time there. What was it that kept him from coming? She mentally shook herself. That was just one more thing she focused on instead of seeing Jerome for who he was. A nice man and a friend. Nothing more. "Well, I'd better get going. These texts should be out in a bit and you can have your room back." She caught a nearly imperceptible flinch. "Don't worry, we'll clean the room well. Maybe don't advertise that someone died in there," he added with a wink. She could see that her laugh surprised him nearly as much as it surprised herself, but what was life if you couldn't laugh about the odd things? "Bye, Jerome." "See you later, Eva." He turned toward the door and she watched him go. Part of her wanted to call out to him and see if they could grab a bite to eat or perhaps a coffee, but she held the words in. She didn't need even more complication in her life. On one hand, Ruben sought to have coffee or a meal with her almost every week, and she had a feeling his interests lay closer to attraction than friendship. She didn't need 2 men in her life vying for attention. She didn't need a man in general, though she couldn't help but picture walking on the beach with Jerome sometimes. His easygoing nature was so different from Ruben's go-go-go attitude. While they were both very nice men, she had enough on her plate already. Turning back to the hallway as yet another tech carried out something from the room, Eva sighed. Mr. Anderson had booked the room for the entirety of the next week, so in some small measure there was a bit of relief there, but she didn't like to think of it like that. Poor man. Her phone beeped, and she saw that Geraldine had texted her. She wanted to drop by to keep the box in the safe. Eva replied that it was a good idea, and then slipped her phone back into her pocket as she walked down the hall. She had a multitude of things to do before her movie date that night, and there was no time to worry about Jerome or Ruben or any of it. Chapter 4. "I love this part," Vicky said, her hands slipping into the buttery popcorn bowl between them. Eva sat next to her in the small cottage, Hocus Pocus playing on the screen in front of them. It was later than she'd expected since Vicky ended up working late, but they were here now, enjoying some Halloween fun. They watched as the characters raced through a graveyard, and Eva finally felt herself relaxing. She hadn't realized how worked up she'd gotten over her staff finding Mr. Anderson. And of course, her conversation with Jerome had been on her mind for hours. She needed this time to unwind, to remind herself that her life was more than work. It was more than her guests and bookings and managing a business. It was friendship and the colors of fall, even if she wouldn't see them in the Florida landscape. She needed to treasure times like these to laugh and relax. "Do you hear that?" Vicky turned around, looking at the door. "What?" Eva quickly paused the movie. In the silence that followed, she heard the sound of the alarm. "Oh, no, not again! Again!" Eva pushed to her feet. "The alarm went off last night. There wasn't anything missing, but it was odd." What she didn't add was the fact that the painting had been moved. No need to worry Vicky. "I'll just go see what's wrong." "I'm coming with you." Vicky picked up an umbrella from a bucket behind the door and held it up like a baseball bat. "What are you going to do with that?" Eva said, chuckling as she slipped into a pair of sandals at the door. "Protect us, that's what? You've seen too many crime shows. Have you forgotten what I do for a living?" she said, giving a pointed look. "Good point," Eva admitted, not liking the fact that her friend was right. Alarms didn't go off for no reason, at least not usually. She opened the door, and they made their way to the back steps of the B&B, past the pool with the glowing bistro lights reflecting back in the still water. The alarm was loud, but not wake the neighbors loud outside, something that was likely a good thing for her, unless there was an actual robbery going on, which she doubted. Pausing at the base of the steps, she reached out to stop Vicky. "Maybe we should wait until the police get here." "I thought you said nothing happened last night. Perhaps it's another false alarm, a messed-up wire or something?" While that wasn't out of the realm of possibilities, Eva wasn't sure she fully believed that was possible. "We'll just look in the window. How about that?" Vicky offered. "Okay." They tiptoed up the steps and peeked in the window next to the door. It was dark inside, and was that glass on the floor? "We need to get inside," Eva said, heart pounding at the sight. She pulled out her access card and scanned them in. Making sure to look left and then right, they moved through the main floor. "What's going on?" a deep voice asked. Eva nearly jumped out of her skin, and Vicky let out a yelp. They both turned to see a man in a blue bathrobe at the entrance to the hallway. "Oh, Mr. Nixon, you startled us!" Eva cried as she took a deep breath. "I'm so sorry. We're having issues with the alarm." It wasn't nearly the full truth, but it was the best explanation at the moment. She just hoped he wouldn't look to the front door and the glass that lay shattered there. "That's 2 nights in a row," he said, stifling a yawn. She wanted to remind him that it was only 10 o'clock, but she did understand that it was a huge inconvenience despite the fact that the alarm rang most loudly in the main area, not in their individual rooms. "Yes, I'm sorry. I'll talk with the company tomorrow and see what can be done." "Night," he said, shuffling off. "You should have asked him to stay," Vicky whispered once he'd left. Eva laughed. "He wouldn't have been much help. I had to carry his bags to his room for him." Vicky rolled her eyes, something Eva only barely caught in the dim light, and then the two rushed to the front window. Outside, the colors of red and blue flashed as a police car drew near to the house. Eva turned to the side, and that's when she realized what was missing. The painting she'd found askew the night before was gone. She moved toward the desk, and there on the floor it lay completely shredded. "Oh, no," Eva said, clutching at her neck. "Oh, sweetie." Vicky came up next to her, arm around her shoulders. "Was that expansive?" "It's not about the money," Eva said, kneeling to pick up the frame. "Wait!" a voice called out. Both women jumped, Eva rushing to stand when they turned to see Jerome. He was in the same dress pants and button-up he'd worn earlier that day, but now the sleeves were rolled up and he'd undone a few buttons, showing off a white shirt underneath. "You scared me," she said, noticing Officer Kent was behind him in the doorway. "Sorry," he said, reaching to flip on the main lights with his pen. "Don't want you corrupting evidence." She shook her head. She knew better than to reach for something at a crime scene, and yet the sad fact was that the painting had belonged to her parents. It was one of the few she'd kept, and now it lay in ruins at her feet. "You're right. I'm sorry. She shook her head. "What are you doing here, Jerome?" "Told you I had paperwork to do." He offered a half-smile. "I was grabbing coffee here with Kent when the alarm company called. Decided I'd come along." "Doesn't seem like a mistake this time, ma'am," the younger officer said. He offered her a look that said he was sorry. Yes, decidedly not, Eva muttered. You've got cameras, though, right? Jerome asked. I do. You do? The officer looked between them, and she felt bad that she hadn't mentioned it to him the night before. We do. I'll pull up the footage, but can I use the computer? Jerome stepped around and, after snapping a few photos with his phone, pulled the painting back with a gloved hand. He was careful with it, even though the canvas was ripped in several places. Didn't get into the safe, I see, he said, motioning behind the desk where the wall safe was located. She had noticed that as well, but she'd been more concerned about the artwork. There wasn't much in the safe except for the box. Was it possible someone was after it? But the only person who had shown interest in it was Mr. Anderson, and he was dead. That thought rested heavily on her, and she wondered again if there was a connection or if it was pure coincidence. Here, she said, stepping up next to Jerome. She turned on the computer, and as they waited, she looked around the rest of the room. Poirot's cage was unharmed. Vicky was over with him, offering a few treats for the fright he must have had when the glass shattered. Everything else seemed to be in order. The sound of the computer being booted up played, and she refocused on the computer screen. Pulling up the security cameras was easy enough, but she wasn't as versed in combing through them. Jerome offered to take over, and she gladly turned over the duty. As Jerome poked around on the computer, Kent asked her several questions, took photos of his own, and then began to write up a preliminary report while they waited. Here's something, Jerome said a few minutes later. They all crowded behind him to watch as a hooded figure broke the glass on the front porch with a rock. Eva noticed he was wearing gloves as he stepped inside. She shivered, and Jerome met her gaze with an encouraging one. We'll find whoever did this. She wanted to share his optimism, but finding the man, she assumed it was a man, seemed unlikely. They could gather his height and possible weight, but as they watched him come in, wreck the painting, attempt to get into the safe and then leave, never once did he show his face. How had he known where the safe was? Or was that an obvious place to hide a safe? She looked around the room, discounting several other pieces of art that rested on exterior walls. But there were a few other interior walls that could have housed a safe behind the artwork there, and nothing seemed to be out of place. I don't know if you'll be able to, Jerome. He met her gaze. We're not that inept. I'm not saying you are, she rushed to confirm. It's just that he never shows his face and there's not much else to go on. He was wearing gloves. Didn't find any prints, boss. There's more we can do, Jerome said, sending Kent a silencing look. Don't worry, Eva. They're really good at what they do, Vicky chimed in. It'll be okay. Eva felt the sudden irrational thought that she didn't want their comfort as much as she'd prefer their focus be on what was wrong, but she pushed those feelings away. She'd grown up independent. It was the nature of being an only child, and with parents as wealthy as hers had been, while they'd been loving parents, they'd been distant at times. She'd learned to do what she could on her own and not rely on others, but as she'd grown older, she began to see the immense value of having a network of friends. Those were just the people she needed now. Thank you, both of you, she said to Kent and Jerome. I know you'll do your best. When Jerome and Officer Kent graciously offered to help her cover up the front window, she agreed, and they set to work making sure it was secure for the night. Jerome also assured her he'd up the patrols that went past her house that night, just in case, but he didn't think anyone was coming back. If what they could read of the crime scene was accurate, someone had broken in, ripped apart the painting covering the safe for the fun of it, and after failing multiple times to unlock the safe, the person had left in a rage. Eva was just thankful that the man hadn't taken out his anger on anything else in the bed and breakfast. Then again, he'd been on a ticking time clock after the alarm went off. Had he expected that? It was hard to tell from what they'd seen in the video surveillance, the recordings of which Jerome had emailed to himself, but the person hadn't appeared to be a professional, at least not in the way that he had come to see them. Still, now that everyone was gone and she was ready to head to her cottage, movie forgotten for now, she had a hard time leaving the main area. There was nothing she could do short of hiring a private security guard, which seemed ridiculous, but she still felt as if she had to do something. Her thoughts went to the pin she'd found near the safe the night before. On a whim, she took a turn and headed into the hallway. She was still thankful that most guests had either been out of the bed and breakfast enjoying the vibrant nightlife of Key West, or they hadn't heard the alarm in their rooms. It was quiet in the hall as she walked to the gray room. Once inside, she looked around again. She hadn't instructed Elena to clean the room yet, That was something she was considering hiring out just to save the poor girl. But she also felt a sort of hesitation about cleaning it. There was no one booked for the week, and something nudged her to wait on the cleaning. Her gaze roamed the familiar room, and the book. The Hemingway tome that had rested on the bedside table was gone. She rushed to the spot where it had been and saw that the phone cord was still there, but the book was nowhere in sight. She got down on her knees and checked beneath the bed, but it was clear. The book was gone. Resting back on her heels, she considered different possibilities. Had the text taken it? Bagged it as what? Evidence? But they considered his death accidental, so there was no reason to take his things. In fact, she'd been informed that she would be in charge of packing everything up and getting it to his next of kin. So why would the book be gone? The break-in. She thought back to the recording they'd watched. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary, but there was a time when the man had disappeared off the camera. She'd assumed he was looking for other wall safes or valuable things, despite the fact that the computer wasn't taken. Was it possible he had come to this room and stolen the book? Eva thought it sounded far-fetched, but she couldn't discount any theory. Listening to her instincts just then, she decided to search the room. She pushed to her feet and began a methodical search, trying her best not to touch anything. Looking everywhere, she ended up finding nothing of use aside from some spare change behind the cushions and a bar of soap that had fallen behind the dresser. She was about to leave when her gaze rested on the bed again. When she was a child, she'd had a diary. It was the one place she put down all of her thoughts, and despite the fact she had no siblings to snoop in on her things, there were maids and house cleaners often in her room. Rather than hide the journal in a drawer where it could be easily found, she'd taken to stuffing it between the mattress and box springs. Thinking on it now, the woman who cleaned her room and made her bed had likely run across it many times, but the musings of a child were nothing compared to what a grown man might have hidden. After all, he'd died on that very bed. She knelt again, and this time shoved her hand into the space between the mattress and springs. She hadn't gotten far when her fingers closed around something cool that felt like glass. It was a phone. Eva turned it over in her hands, and the screen flashed on. She tried swiping it open, but it registered as locked. Nonetheless, she tried several times to open it, going so far as to use the last 4 digits of the credit card Mr. Anderson had left on file. Nothing worked. Letting out a sigh, she put the phone in a locked drawer of her desk and returned to her cottage. By now it was nearing midnight, and she was exhausted. It was time to sleep, and perhaps in the morning things would be more clear. If nothing else, she would give the phone to Jerome so he could get text to access it. She wasn't sure why, but for some reason, Mr. Anderson's death didn't seem natural to her anymore. There were too many things that seemed to interconnect for it all to be coincidence. Chapter 5. You found this last night? Jerome sounded incredulous. I couldn't sleep. She didn't want to tell him that she'd been nervous to go back to her cottage alone, afraid that someone might come there instead of just attacking her bed and breakfast. Even after she'd found the phone and gone home, she'd still triple-checked the locks. I'll send someone over to pick it up and have the techs look into it. He sounded distracted, and she found she was a little disappointed he hadn't suggested stopping by himself, but she mentally shook the feeling away. Sounds good, thank you. He cleared his throat. I'd come and get it myself, but I'm swamped right now. It feels like everyone has gone on vacation at the same time. She smiled. I understand. Thank you again for stopping by last night, that is. Of course. Did you get someone to fix up that window? Boss is on it. He's my gardener, but also my handyman. Oh, good. Well, let me know if there's anything else I can do. Will do. Bye, Jerome. He hung up, and she looked at the phone again. Rather than put it back in the locked drawer, she decided to put it in the safe. It seemed silly. It wasn't likely that it was important to anyone but the deceased man, and yet, what if it was? What if her hunch was correct, and whoever had broken into the B&B had gone into the grey room and stolen Mr. Anderson's Hemingway book? It seemed far-fetched when she thought of it like that. There were probably a dozen shops within walking distance that sold the very same book. And yet someone had taken it. She'd asked Jerome if the techs who had been at the B&B were supposed to take belongings, and he'd said no, as she'd suspected. So it had to be someone else. The safe opened with a soft beep, and as she moved to set the phone aside, she saw the box. Checking over her shoulder that no one was around, she pulled it out and closed the safe again. It seemed as if people were attempting to get at this very box. Or they had been ordinary thieves looking for money, though that didn't line up since other valuable things had been left behind. Either way, she wondered if the box was the key to this. What was so important about it, or the map it contained? She sat, carefully pulling out the map and unfolding it on the desk blotter. It looked the same as it had the first day she'd examined it. Geraldine had been late to an appointment when she dropped it off for safekeeping, so Eva hadn't been able to gain any more insight into what the importance of it was, but the map man said it appeared genuine. If so, what did that mean? A treasure map, perhaps? She giggled to herself at the thought. Why was it hard to believe that her friend had come across something like that? Then again, there were enough sunken ships to last a lifetime of treasure hunting for those who valued that type of adventure. Even if it led to nothing, it could be a fun adventure. Eva held up the map now, looking at it from a different angle, and that's when she caught sight of a watermark. There, by the compass at the bottom right corner, was an image only visible through the paper. She didn't know how that was possible or what made it visible. Was it something like the images in money? She leaned closer to study it. Squinting until she could make it out, Eva let out a cry of success when she realized what she was seeing. It was a penny, or the image of one. It was clearly an old penny, something before 1959 when the image on the back was changed. But why a penny? Just then, a flurry of movement outside caught her attention. A tall man with a scowling expression was walking up the steps. She didn't recognize him, and after the scare from the night before, she decided to put the box and map away. She quickly slipped both into the locked drawer, stowing the key in her pocket just as the man came inside. He seemed to look at the new pane of glass Boss had installed with curiosity, but he quickly turned his attention to her. "Hello," he said, walking up to her with hands gripped behind his back. "How may I help you? I'm afraid we're booked up at the moment, unless you're here for a reservation to brunch." There weren't many reasons non-guests came to the B&B, but she tried to cover her bases. "Oh, no. That's not why I'm here." He released his hands and rubbed at his jaw before answering. "I'm actually the grandson of the man who died here yesterday." Her eyebrows rose. She'd looked into Mr. Anderson's files and noticed that he'd signed up for an excursion with her friend Jim down at the harbor. She had him send over Mr. Anderson's release forms, but unfortunately, he'd neglected to put an emergency contact down. What was more likely was that one of Jim's 10 grandkids had been running the counter that day and they'd skipped over it in lieu of more business. "You are?" "Yes. I would like to retrieve his belongings as well as anything he might have kept in the safe. Valuables, things like that." "I'm sorry, but I'll need to see some identification." Not only was it odd the way this man had suddenly shown up, but his request was just as strange. Had he been in the area when his grandfather died? The few conversations she'd had with Mr. Anderson had been brief, but she had at least learned that he lived in Virginia. How likely was it that his grandson would already be here? Then again, she didn't want to say something she'd regret only to find out that he was, in fact, Mr. Anderson's grandson. Asking for identification seemed like the easiest way. Do you have to?" She met his gaze, her brow furrowing. "Yes, I'm afraid I do. I'm in charge of taking care of his belongings, and I can't just hand them over to the first person who walks in." She softened her words with a smile, but he took a step back. "Oh, right. Well..." He patted his pockets as if he were looking for his ID. "I must have left my wallet at the hotel I'm staying at. I'll get it and be back." Without waiting for a reply, he spun on his heels and left. In the wake of him leaving, Eva realized she'd seen a wallet-shaped bulge in his back pocket. Had he just lied to her? Part of her wanted to call Jerome and mention the young man's odd behavior, but just then she saw a patrol car pull up to the curb. It was likely the officer Jerome had sent over to retrieve the phone. Seeing that it was Officer Kent, she waited until he stepped inside and then explained what had just happened. He thanked her for the heads-up and said she'd done the right thing by asking for identification. He also told her to call if the man came back, though he made it clear he doubted he would. She wasn't so sure. It was clear to her that someone was after information that Mr. Anderson had in his possession, or once had in his possession. If the thief from the night before had walked away with more than the book, she would never know, but she did know one thing. She would make sure the cameras were recording at all times. She'd catch anyone in the act, should they be bold enough to try something else. Sunday afternoon brought clouds rolling in, and Eva wondered if Geraldine might cancel their plans. They had decided to head back to the booth where she'd bought the box to see if the owner had any more information about it. After a text confirming they were still on, Eva donned a light jacket with a hood and took her waterproof bag out of the closet, rather than carry around her leather purse. Instructing the cab to Geraldine's house, she picked up the older woman who had also dressed for the weather in a raincoat and ankle rain boots, and they set off for the assortment of tents that housed the pop-up market. "How long does this go on for?" Eva asked. "I'm not sure," Geraldine said, climbing out of the cab first. "But I think at least the rest of next week." They took in all of the tents that had filled Mallory Square, and Eva broke into a smile. Despite the weather, there were still crowds of people looking through the booths and digging for the best finds. "I'm glad they do this every year," she said, following Geraldine through the maze. "I think it's a fun draw." "I agree," Geraldine said, taking a narrow alley until she paused to point ahead. "There, that's the tent. But I don't see the man who sold me the box." "Perhaps he's on a break?" Eva offered. "Perhaps." They weaved through the rest of the tents until they were under the large one housing all sorts of antiques, collectibles, and odds and ends. It smelled slightly musty, and right away Eva spotted several Hemingway-themed items, but she wasn't surprised by this. With Hemingway's history in the area, it made sense that they would cater to that. "I'm going to ask about him," Geraldine said. Eva nodded and turned her attention to the massive tables hosting everything from antique shoehorns to the yellowing pages of old books. She just found a lovely glass insulator when Geraldine came back, a young man trailing her. "Is this him?" Eva asked. "No," Geraldine rolled her eyes. "This young man says that he knows no one by the description I gave, but he'd take a look at a picture of the box to see if he could help." While it wasn't ideal, Eva wasn't completely surprised that he didn't know who Geraldine spoke of. Often at markets like these, local help would be hired on a part-time basis to help with sales, and then they would leave as soon as it was all over. While the market was still going, the men could have no knowledge of one another if they had opposite shifts. Eva pulled out her phone and swiped to the picture of the outside of the box to show the man. He studied it for a moment before looking back at Geraldine. "I recognize this." "Well, what can you tell me about it?" "What did the guy who sold it to you say?" Eva's eyes narrowed. Why would that matter? The young man looked between them, then looked around as if to see who might be listening in. Finding no one paying them attention, he shrugged. "We're told to back up stories, just in case." "Does that go for making up stories?" Geraldine said. "No, not really. Just that if you sell something, sell it good, you know?" Eva heard what he wasn't saying, but all that mattered was what this young man might know about the box. "What can you tell us about this? Do you have records or something?" "No, nothing like that." Geraldine put a hand on her hip. "How can you be sure if you haven't checked?" "Look." He held up his hands in a placating manner. "All I'm going to say is that there were rumors that this belonged to Hemingway. We're not really supposed to let that out, but if you drop a hint here and there—" He rolled his eyes skyward. "What's the harm?" "But you don't know for sure?" Eva asked. "No, the thing is, we have no paperwork for a lot of this stuff. If we did, it wouldn't cost what it does." "I see." Eva did understand, even though she didn't think it was a particularly good way to run a business. They relied on rumor to sell, and whether it was true or not, they were better for it due to the fact that the merchandise sold. So it could or could not be from Hemingway's personal collection. Geraldine let out a sigh. Eva would bet more on the side of the was not from the collection, but she didn't want to make her friend feel bad. "Did someone say Hemingway?" a man asked. He was tall and distinguished-looking in a white linen shirt and black slacks. The hair at his temples was turning gray, but otherwise he looked robust. He stepped up, peering over Geraldine's shoulder to the image that Eva still held of the box. "That looks original." Eva quickly put the phone down, and Geraldine gave the man her best glare, but he didn't seem fazed. "Excuse me," Geraldine said, shifting so her back was to the man. "Hold on now," the man said, wedging himself in between the woman and what looked like an 1800s shaving stand with a marble top. "I know my Hemingway." "And just who are you?" Geraldine said. She had a way of making everything sound like a threat, but the man didn't bat an eye. "Francis Tidewald. And as I said, I'm somewhat of an expert on Hemingway." I take part in a convention here every year and have really gotten to know the area and, in turn, the history of the man." Eva chewed her lip. He seemed awfully chatty, though she'd known many B&B guests to go overboard when talking about a subject that they loved. "Thank you, but we're just trying to have a conversation with the nice clerk here," Geraldine said. She again tried to shift him out of their circle, but he readjusted. "I couldn't help but overhear," he began, though Eva wasn't sure where he'd been, since she hadn't seen him close enough to overhear what they'd said. "Hemingway had a great many items left in the house after he settled in Idaho. You know, he retained the title to his Key West home until his death, tragic as it was." Eva was going to reply that Hemingway was a familiar subject to many in Key West, but instead she pressed her lips together. It was as if two ideas in her mind coalesced, and she was seeing clearly now. Sadly, she'd have to wait to share her light bulb moment with Geraldine until they were out of earshot of both the clerk and the overly helpful Hemingway fanatic. In fact, they stood through several more minutes of the man's odd Hemingway trivia before Eva felt she could make an excuse for them to go. While they hadn't learned much from the salesman, she had the next step in discovering what the map might uncover. And she couldn't wait to tell Geraldine. They were just making their excuses to leave when Eva noticed it. The small pin on the man's jacket. She was standing just far enough away that a close observation was impossible, but she could tell it looked the same, and yet it was different. Something tickled at the back of her mind as she took it in. Finally, it clicked. It was a mirror reflection of Mr. Anderson's pin with a slightly different style of magnifying glass. It struck her then that this man was somehow connected to Mr. Anderson. The pin was too similar to not be connected to the one he'd worn. But how? "Excuse me," she paused, her gaze going to the pin near his polo shirt lapel. Eva could almost feel the daggers Geraldine was shooting into her back. "Where did you get that pin?" The man's smile faltered. It's just—" His hands fluttered to his pockets, and then to his hat, and back to a space in front of him. "It's just an association I'm a part of, that's all." The next instant he spun on his heels and left the tent. "If I'd have known how easy it would be to get rid of him, I'd have asked about that pin sooner," Geraldine said, as they made their way back to where a line of cabs stood waiting for customers. "It is odd," Eva admitted. "I assumed he'd be happy to talk about it since he was happy to talk about everything else, and yet he closed up like a clam. Why wear a pin of an association you don't want to connect yourself to?" "Who knows, but good riddance," Geraldine said, waving her hand toward the next cab in line. Eva was about to share her next plan of action with Geraldine as they climbed into the cab when her phone rang. It was Vicky. "Hello?" she said, the cabbie waiting for their destination. "Eva, it's Vicky. I have news." "All right," Eva said, looking between the cab driver and Geraldine, feeling helpless. "Mr. Anderson didn't die of natural causes." She blinked. "What?" "He was murdered." She shot a look at Geraldine. "Do you mind dropping me off at the police station? You can go on home after if you'd like." She knew her revelation would have to wait. "I'll do no such thing. I'm staying with you," Geraldine said. "Police department," she told the cab driver, "and step on it." Chapter 6. "And here I thought we were going to see that handsome detective of yours," Geraldine said, tucking a strand of hair into the head wrap she wore. "He's not my anything, Geraldine." Eva stepped into the elevator at the police station and pressed the bottom floor. "You know that." "Perhaps he isn't," she said, side-eyeing Eva. "But he could be." Eva wasn't ready to have this conversation. Not now, and certainly not in the elevator on the way down to see Vicky in the morgue. "Let's just focus on what killed poor Mr. Anderson." "Fine," Geraldine said, drama lacing the word. They stepped out into the super-chilled floor, and Eva immediately pulled on her thin rain jacket for a little extra warmth. Geraldine seemed more interested in what the techs were doing through the large clear panels of glass that kept the hallway separated from the labs, but she gently tugged her friend down the hall toward Vicky's office. "You got here fast," she said, coming out from behind her desk and motioning to the small couch and pair of chairs under the window. "We were just leaving the market at Mallory Square." "What were you doing there?" "Geraldine has found a treasure map," Eva said with a smirk. "Well, what's more like it is I've uncovered a map that could have belonged to Hemingway, but the jury seems to be out on that." She fell onto the couch in a dramatic fashion and then sat up the next moment. What's this I hear about murder? Vicky shot an anxious look to the door and stood to close it before returning to the chair facing Eva and Geraldine. I've just sent my report off to Detective Makos, but it looks to be more than a simple death from natural causes. What did he die from? Geraldine asked. It's odd, Vicky said, looking between Eva and Geraldine, but it looks like he took an overdose of anticoagulants. Could it have been accidental? Eva asked. I got Mr. Anderson's medical records for my examination, and he was prescribed some, the same kind found in his system, but the dosage would have been extremely high, more so than any one person could take accidentally, unless he'd been suicidal. She looked between the ladies. Though I don't know anyone who goes on vacation and then overdoses on anticoagulants. It's just not a typical way to commit suicide. I don't know that I've ever heard of it, Geraldine said. Eva looked at her, humor evident on her features. You haven't, Great Sherlock? Oh, you! Geraldine winked at Eva. I've read so many murder mysteries I could likely get away with a murder or two. She made a point to look at Vicky. Not that I would, mind you. I'm glad to hear that, Vicky smiled. I'd hate to ask Jerome to lock up a friend. They shared a chuckle, but Eva brought them back to the point of their visit. So you say this is murder, then? I'd be hard-pressed to put it as an accident. There were no pills found at the scene of his death, at least according to the reports I read, so there has to be another explanation. This doesn't fall under likely poisoning, so barring I just put suspicious death, I'd call it a murder. That puts a bit of a stain on the grey room, Eva said. Not that I care so much about business, just that it's something to consider. Poor Mr. Anderson. Did you know him well? Vicky asked. Not really, Eva admitted. He wasn't very talkative, not like other guests I've had, but he seemed kind. I did think he had an unusual interest in the box and map that you brought over, Geraldine. Is there any way this could all be connected? Geraldine's eyes went wide. How? It's just an old wooden box. Though, of course, the map man said that the box and the map seemed genuine, but no one would really know what it is unless... Unless, Eva said. Map man? Vicky asked. Geraldine ignored Vicky's question. I'm just wondering if it's somehow recognizable for some reason we don't know. Like it's on a website somewhere? Perhaps. Geraldine frowned. But I don't understand why it would be at the market as a known Hemingway artifact, though without proof, and not be snatched up by someone. Eva didn't have a good answer for that either. It didn't make a lot of sense. I'm sorry, but did you say map man? Vicky tried again. Eva took a moment to explain the man and his specialty to her. Then Geraldine gave more of the details he'd given her on the box and map, their approximate dates of origin, and where some of the areas could connect on the map, but he'd made it clear that without the key, they couldn't know how to orient the map. Vicky's phone beeped. I'm sorry, I've got to get to another autopsy, but thanks for stopping by. Please don't spread this around. I need to confirm with Jerome, but it seemed important to let you know, Eva. I mean, someone murdered one of your guests. Eva felt a chill of fear race up her spine. When it came out like that, it sounded much worse than it appeared. She wouldn't mention the possibility of murder to any of her guests yet, but it was something she needed to keep ahead of. Would the press get a hold of this? They had already done damage to her reputation during a previous case where 2 reporters had pretended to be married in order to stay in the B&B for more inside scoop. Thankfully, Mr. Anderson's death seemed to have drifted past the news outlets unnoticed, and she hoped to keep it that way. At least for now. Thank you, Eva said, hugging her friend before turning to the door. See you at book club, if not before, Vicky said with a smile. Then added, we still need to finish our movie. Eva agreed and left for the elevator with Geraldine on her heels. They took another cab, stopping to drop the older woman off, and then Eva headed home. She'd missed several calls while meeting with Vicky and checked her messages on the way back to the bed and breakfast. One was from Jerome saying he needed to stop by to see her. Rather than call and risk being overheard by the cab driver, she shot off a text saying for him to meet her any time after 3 at the B&B. His response was a quick and short okay, which only led her to wonder even more. Why did he want to stop by? Perhaps it was about Mr. Anderson? Or was it possible he was finally going to ask her out to coffee? The thought shocked her, and in the wake of their meeting with Vicky made her feel a little shameful. A man had died, and she was thinking about the attractive detective. No, she would focus on how Mr. Anderson had gotten a lethal dose of drugs and discover why he'd been targeted in the first place. All other things were to be put to the back burner. Eva found herself at a small cafe down the street from her bed and breakfast, sitting across from none other than Detective Makos. He had, in fact, invited her out to coffee, but it was nothing like she'd imagined. His reason was because he'd discovered footage of when he believed Mr. Anderson had been poisoned, and he needed Eva to see if she recognized who sat across from the older man. "Sorry for the unconventional setup," he said, indicating his laptop on the small table between them. It left barely enough room for Eva's hot lavender latte and his iced coffee. "I just figured being here we'd be able to see the angle of things. It's the same table from the video." She knew he was just doing his job, but they'd crammed themselves into a small, secluded corner of the coffee shop to best view the footage. Jerome sat rather close to her with his leg pressed up against hers. She couldn't help but be distracted just a little by the spicy scent of his cologne and how his hair fell across his forehead in thick chunks. "Eva," he said, and she realized he'd said something else that she'd completely missed. "Sorry, what?" "Are you ready?" Yes, I'm ready." He gave her an odd look and then shrugged, turning to the computer. "There's no sound or anything, but you can see that this man," he indicated a dark shadow across from Mr. Anderson, "he's our likely suspect." "Why do you say that?" "Watch," Jerome said, tapping a button that made the footage speed up until he tapped another button and it slowed to normal speed. "Mr. Anderson gets up to go to the restroom, or so I assume, and see, right there." She'd almost missed it, but it was clear that once Mr. Anderson was gone from the table, the man across from him pulled out something from an interior coat pocket and slipped it into the man's coffee. Eva gasped. "He was drugged!" "Yep. I assume you've talked to Vicky?" The way he looked at her made her smile, slightly ashamed and yet not. Jerome knew she would have talked with Vicky. "We spoke a little while ago." Jerome nodded. "I got on this the second she said he was poisoned. I checked his recent credit card charges. The very last one before he was found dead was here at the Coffee Cabana." "Poor man," she said, looking down at her drink and hesitating a moment before taking a sip. So whoever he met with was the killer. But why? Why him? He was a quiet older man who rented a room from me. There didn't seem to be anything unusual about him. Except the book that went missing from his room, she reminded herself. True, but there has to be some reason. I'm digging into his history outside of Key West, and we've got techs working on his phone. There has to be some kind of connection, something that would be motivation for murder. It's just hard to know where to start. She opened her mouth to suggest the Hemingway connection when Jerome looked up and met her gaze. It was clear there was something on his mind. "What is it?" she asked. Had he made a connection in the case? "Have you thought more about the PI licensing?" She deflated, though only slightly, and rested back against the wooden chair. "I haven't." Truth be told, she'd been more focused on the Hemingway map and the dead man found in her bed and breakfast, not to mention the break-ins she'd endured recently. "I know, it's a terrible time to bring this up, but my captain wants a little more professionalism to our conversations. I did tell him you've helped me quite a bit, but..." "So he wants me to become a private investigator?" This was the first she'd heard of it. "Not exactly," he said. "But as you can imagine, he's had serious reservations with me sharing elements of open cases with you as a civilian." She let out a breath. It made sense, though she didn't appreciate her worth as a person being tied to some set of requirements put forth by the state of Florida. "I'm still thinking about it," she said, knowing that it hadn't been long since he'd pushed this the last time. "But I do appreciate the candor." He nodded, and then turned back to his computer. "It's clear here that the person either suspected or knew of the cameras. He wears a hat the whole time. I've got someone searching through receipts that day, but from the amount that Anderson paid, I'd say he bought our guy's drink here." Eva was shocked that Jerome was continuing with the conversation, but she was quick to pick up on the fact that he didn't want to belabor the point. He'd brought it up, they'd discussed it, and that was that. Eva looked back at the computer screen. What happens next? He gets up and leaves, despite the drugs in his system? From what I got off of Vicky's report, it would be a while before he felt the full effects of what he'd been given. We see the friend leave here. Jerome fast-forwarded the recording to where they see him leave, still no visual of his face. And then a few minutes later, Mr. Anderson leaves. They watched as he did just that. He looks fine. There's a detectable wobble, however slight. Jerome leaned forward, waiting. There. But as our report indicated, I think he made it back to the B&B and then expired in his room. Eva shivered. What I don't understand is why he didn't call someone or ask for help. Jake was there the whole time at the front desk. You did find his phone under the bed. I can't help but wonder if he was just too out of it to make the call. I'll spare you the details as to what this type of overdose involves, but it's not pretty. Is there a pretty overdose? She said, more to herself than him. Good point. He leaned back and closed his laptop. I'm still having Tex go over this video to see if I've missed some aspect of the guy so we could get a view of his face. I've even checked the street cameras around here, but there are no good images of this guy. We know he's about 5'10" and of medium build. That's about it. She finished her latte and then looked over at him. Did you really ask me to come so you could show all of this to me? What about your boss? He looked thoughtfully down at his coffee, taking a sip and letting out a long sigh before he seemed ready to answer her. Truthfully, I miss working with a partner and you're the next best thing. He grimaced. I meant that as a compliment, if it wasn't clear. I'll take it as such then, she smiled. I like bouncing ideas off of someone, and while I've got some great officers to work with, they don't approach things like a detective. They approach it like an officer. You've got a keen eye and a quick mind, Miss Stewart, and as long as you're game, I'd like to keep the bouncing going. Even if I don't go for my license, she pressed. We'll see. He finished his drink and packed up the computer. Taking the cue, she stood, tossing her to-go mug in the trash, and turned to follow Jerome outside. Just as she did, the waitress sidestepped her and readjusted the table they'd been at, pulling one of the chairs out and replacing it at another table. She felt bad for not leaving a tip on the table, but she'd left a good tip at the bar and hoped that would cover the woman for her trouble. One last thing, Eva, he said, pulling the laptop bag strap over his shoulder when she joined him outside. Be careful. Kent told me about the guy asking for Mr. Anderson's things. From what I can tell, he didn't have a grandson. She nodded. She'd assumed as much, but it was good to have the confirmation. I'll be careful, Eva said, turning toward her bed and breakfast a few blocks away. Talk to you later. He nodded and they went in opposite directions, but at the end of the block she turned back, only to see him looking at her. He grinned and turned around, just as the light indicated she could walk across. Chapter 7. Eva pulled her phone from her pocket. She didn't have much further to go before she reached the bed and breakfast, but there was a small park, a postage stamp of a thing really, that she loved to stop in. She had to make a call to Geraldine with the information she'd remembered but hadn't yet imparted, so she stopped off and took a seat on a bench shrouded by palm trees and vegetation. Hello, Geraldine answered. Hey, Geraldine, Eva here. I forgot that I remembered something I need to tell you. You forgot what you remembered? Huh? Eva smiled. Good point. That made no sense. I just mean to say that while we were at the market, I thought of something about the box. Spit it out, she said, sounding more excited. It's about the map, Eva began. I was examining it the other day and held it up to the light. Ooh, good idea. It actually turned out to be a great idea because it showed something watermarked behind the compass. What was it? Geraldine was fairly bursting now. It looked like the image of a penny. Penny. Less excited now. Yes. At first that meant nothing to me. Still, when we were talking about Hemingway and his home here, I remembered something. He had a penny pushed into the concrete of the pool he had built for he and his wife at the time. A penny in the pool. She sounded doubtful. It was something like a joke, Eva went on to explain, trying to remember all she'd learned at the tour she'd taken of the house years before. He said the pool had taken his last cent to build. Ah, I see. I didn't know that. Eva wasn't surprised. It seemed like many lifelong Key West residents hadn't spent time at the Ernest Hemingway Home and Museum. Of course, people weren't tourists in their own hometowns, so many likely took such treasures for granted. What does this mean for the map? She asked. I'm not sure, but I think the penny has to be part of the key to figuring out the direction since there are no markers. Remember, Mapman said we couldn't truly read the map until the compass was deciphered. True! Now Geraldine was fairly bursting once again. So we need to go to the house to see the pool. Yes, but I don't think they're open on Sundays. What if we go tomorrow? We could break in, she said with a giggle. How about we go during their open hours? Likely the best option if we don't want to get kicked out. They shared a laugh, and Geraldine said, Oh, fine. You've directed me away from a life of crime so far. Why should this be any different? They made plans to meet the next day, and Eva stood to head home. She was excited to consider what they might find at the Hemingway home and with the penny. Something still felt odd about all of this, though. If there was any way that the box was somehow connected to Mr. Anderson, and she couldn't see a clear connection, would they continue to be in danger from whoever had harmed Mr. Anderson, assuming they were one and the same? That thought made her speed along toward the safety of the bed and breakfast. There was still at least an hour of true golden sunlight left in the day, but she didn't fancy being out late that night. Soon she saw the white picket fence ahead, the light blue paint standing out surrounded by greenery, and there was a woman on the front porch. She sat perched on one of the chairs and looked out of place in dingy jeans and a black t-shirt. She wasn't a guest, Eva knew that much, but what was she doing on the front porch? Eva watched as the woman turned in her chair, as if she were admiring the fall decorations Eva had put up a few days before. She was thin, her hair hanging to her shoulders in loose waves of dark brown, slightly stringy as if in need of a wash. As Eva drew closer, however, there was an air of familiarity about the woman's profile. Eva couldn't place it, but she looked like someone she knew. Coming down the walkway, the strange woman continued to be transfixed by the pumpkins and fake leaves Eva had strung up. When Eva's foot landed on a creaky step, the woman turned slowly and her blue eyes widened. She took in Eva from her hair to her tennis shoes, and then a small smile emerged. When she stood, she was almost as tall as Eva. When she spoke, the words were out of the past. "Hello, cousin." Eva sat on one side of her couch, nursing a cup of tea, and on the other sat the odd woman who had called her cousin. Seeing that her parents hadn't had any siblings that she knew of, it was an impossibility that the woman, who called herself Sarah, was actually her cousin. Nonetheless, she did look familiar. On the promise of getting the whole story, Eva invited Sarah to speak in Eva's cottage so as to keep their privacy. They'd skipped going inside the B&B. Eva didn't fancy explaining who the woman was to Jake just yet. "So," Eva said, now that they were seated, a plate of Milano cookies between them. "So," Sarah said, her gaze still roaming the cottage as if it had been a long time since she had been in a home. "I guess I have to say I don't think it's possible we're actually cousins," she started out, making sure her words remained neutral. Eva wasn't angry because she still sensed something oddly familiar about the woman, but she also didn't want Sarah to think she was going to take everything she said at face value. Even the thought of having Sarah inside her home caused her to wonder what Jerome would think. Would he chew her out for letting someone inside who had no true connection to her? "I know. We're not related by blood, but I grew up knowing who you were." "You did?" Eva was so shocked she could barely contain the multitude of questions racing through her mind. "Yeah, let me start at the beginning," she said, blushing slightly as if she'd bungled it all. "In all the ways that count, my mom was like a daughter to Sal Lassero." Eva gasped. "Uncle Sal?" "I'm pretty sure that was his other life," she shrugged. "Sal was a hard guy to figure out, but from what my mom told me, he knew your father, was good friends with him, and he'd kind of adopted you when your parents were away on trips, right?" Eva nodded, not able to find her voice. "Well, my mom, Megan, was like that to him too, but on the other side of the tracks, if you know what I mean." Sarah looked down at the mug in her hands. "He spent time over there, doing work for her, caring for her, stuff like that. She was a bit older than you, and one of those neighborhood kids, you know?" Sarah shrugged again. "But she felt like Sal was a father to her?" Ava knew what that felt like. Sal had been the same way to her, not replacing her father who had loved her dearly, but being there for her when her dad was out of town or during the summers when she had more free time than was good for a kid her age. "Mom told me you helped Sal with cases, just like she did, and you were, another shrug, tight with him." Ava nodded again. Her apprehension about Sarah's true identity was still there, but she was also intrigued by her assertion. If it were true, she wouldn't have known Sal. Not really, because she was too young. But that would mean her information had come secondhand from her mother. Did Ava know her mother? And another troubling thought was whether this young woman knew of Ava's wealth. Was this some sort of avenue for her to either bleed money from Ava or perhaps blackmail her in some twisted way to gain money? Ava hated thinking like that, but she'd heard Jerome's voice in her head saying she needed to be careful. "All that to say, the girl continued, her accent sounding like it came from New Jersey. Mom told me, by way of what Sal told her, that you were a decent person. Eva braced herself, ready to turn the young woman down when she asked for money. And I was just wondering if you had a job opening or something. Sarah finally met her gaze. My life's not gone like I'd planned it, she admitted. But I kept remembering those stories my mom told me and I looked you up. You got this big place and I thought, if I can just make it to Key West, maybe Aunt Eva would help me. I know you don't owe me anything, but would you think about it? Eva hadn't expected that. She was still careful to consider that the job request could also be a scam, but she wasn't without her own resources. I'm not sure I have an opening, but I can think about it. How long will you be in town? Long as I need to be. She pushed a stringy strand of hair behind her ear. I think I'm ready for a change in my life. It hasn't been easy, and I won't lie to you that I've got a bit of a past. Nothing I haven't made right, mind you, but I'm ready for that to change. I just need a chance. Eva looked on the woman with compassion. While she wasn't ready to have Sarah join her staff, she wanted to test out the waters. Why don't I get you a hotel for a few days while we work things out? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You don't have to do that. Really, I can fend for myself. I'm sure you can, Eva admitted, knowing it was true. But let me do this for you. For Sal. They shared a smile, and then Eva stood. Let's grab dinner, and then we'll get you a room. Thanks, Sarah said, picking up the one backpack she had. Eva assumed that was all she owned and felt compassion well up. She would treat the young woman to a nice hotel for a few days, get to know her, and perhaps see if Jerome could help check out Sarah's background a bit. Then she'd make the choice of whether it would work out for Sarah to stay and help, or if there was something else Eva could do for her. As Eva stood, she couldn't help but think about what a wild week it had been. In the midst of trying to see if a map led to treasure and figuring out why a man had lost his life in her bed and breakfast, a woman showed up from Eva's past. It was just another in the line of odd occurrences, and yet Eva knew that things had a way of lining up. Whether Sarah stayed and was added to the B&B staff, or whether Eva helped her in another way, she was glad for the chance to get to know her. She led the way to the door and then stopped to face her. What's your last name, Sarah? Fisk, Sarah Fisk. Eva smiled. It's nice to meet you, Sarah Fisk. You too, Miss Stewart. Call me Eva. Sarah nodded, and they left the cottage, enjoying the cool evening air and the sound of bustling traffic on the street in Key West. Chapter 8. Eva studied the map again. She'd been up at dawn with the weight of thoughts resting on her, of her dinner with Sarah the night before, and how seemingly all of her information had been in line with what Eva remembered of Uncle Sal and his unlikely friendship with her father. Even the stories he'd told her of where he'd grown up and how he regularly went back to visit the neighborhoods there. It all seemed to match Eva's memories. And then there was the map and their visit to the Hemingway house and museum that day. She'd taken what precautions she could with the box and map, also keeping it exclusively in the safe behind her desk. But what would happen if they discovered something at the pool? What would the penny indicate? For you, boss, Anton said, walking up so quietly to her that she jumped at the sound of his voice. Oh, sorry. It's okay, she said, waving him off while accepting the tray of food he'd brought from the kitchen for her. I'm just jumpy this morning, I guess. He gave her a knowing look. We're all on edge since Mr. Anderson, he admitted. Yes, it's a tragedy. She'd brought the staff together to explain to them what had really happened to Mr. Anderson and asked them all to keep their eyes and ears open. Of course, they were a small staff, and when Eva herself wasn't at the main desk, she didn't expect them to keep as vigilant as she would. I was wondering, he said, taking a step back so she wouldn't have to crane her neck back quite so much. Should Anton cancel brunch for this week? Anton's brunches were quickly becoming famous in Key West, and they were always booked days in advance. She knew if he were to cancel one now, there would be quite an uproar, and they would have to reschedule numerous people. No, let's keep it. She nodded to herself as if to agree that she'd made the right call. We've faced an upset, but it's not public knowledge yet, and I think it's important things go on as planned. Do you agree, or do you want to cancel? Oh, Ms. S., you know me. Anton would host a brunch if there was a hurricane outside. Eva laughed. Thanks, Anton. And thanks for breakfast. This looks amazing. Thought you could use the chocolate-filled croissant. She grinned. The best medicine. He nodded and left, the sense of breakfast wafting up to meet her. It smelled amazing, and while she hadn't had an appetite earlier, she did now. A few hours later, and a lot of business paperwork done, Geraldine showed up at the B&B with a smile and a pair of walking shoes on. "Ready?" she said, her grin lighting up her entire face. "Yes, let me just retrieve the map." She pulled the box from the safe and extracted the map, slipping it into her tote bag, and then replaced the box in the safe. She knew Jake was scheduled for the front desk in an hour, but until then, Benita would hold down the fort, connecting with guests as Elena went about her cleaning. Even Paz was there early that day, working on the back landscaping, and she felt confident leaving the bed and breakfast in their capable hands. "Let's go." They set off, and were soon exiting the cab to the front of the museum. After paying their entrance fee, they joined a tour and enjoyed learning more about the history of Hemingway in Key West, his life and his writing. When the tour was over, they set off to walk the grounds. Everywhere they went, they spotted cats, the famous Hemingway cats, and Geraldine couldn't help but exclaim over each one. "Perhaps you should talk to Kay and Pete about getting a cat," Eva offered. "Oh, I don't." Geraldine hesitated when they saw yet another cat sleeping by the pool, and the protest died on her lips. "Perhaps I should." Eva hadn't expected her to agree, but she laughed and agreed with her friend. Having a cat at home would probably be a good thing for the woman who lived alone. "Where is this penny supposed to be?" Geraldine said after they'd done one circuit of the pool. "I'm not sure. I could ask." "No, let's find it ourselves." Eva saw the challenge light up Geraldine's eyes, so they went to work scoping out every inch of the pool until they finally found it. "Here it is," Eva said, kneeling down. "Oh, yes, I see it! How exciting!" A cat walked by and Geraldine reached out to run a hand along its back. "Wonder what this one is named." They had seen where each cat was named after an older movie star, and Eva could just imagine the black and white cat having a name like Cary Grant or something. But she quickly refocused on the penny as she pulled the map from her bag. Holding the paper up to the light again, she saw that not only was the front of the map not the correct way to view it, but that the penny's head had to be lined up just right. She went to work moving it this way and that, frequently adjusting it different ways in the light. After several attempts, she finally got the designs to line up once Geraldine offered to hold up her phone's flashlight to help with the placement. "There," Eva said, her voice coming out in a whisper. "I think that's it." They took in the exact placement, and Eva tilted her head to the left, then the right. "What do you see?" Geraldine asked. I think..." Eva shifted her view one last time, looking up to the sky, then back to Geraldine. "Get out a piece of paper." She did, and Eva indicated that she had to copy the points of the compass to it. She had Geraldine write north where southwest would have been, and so on around the compass. "I don't understand," Geraldine said once Eva had stood and replaced the map in the tote. "I do." Eva was practically giddy with excitement. "Don't you see? The map was created with north actually where the southwest point on the map would have been. It's a bit like a cipher, and if we adjust the directions to fit that..." "What about it being backward?" Geraldine pointed out. "I'm not sure about that yet," Eva admitted. "We'll have to look into it, but at least we know which way is actually north." "What if it was done backwards so that the keys indicated wouldn't look familiar?" Eva bounced on the balls of her feet. "That might just be it," she said. "We'll have Jake scan it and flip it, then see what we find." After spending another 15 minutes petting the cats and enjoying the lush gardens of the museum and Hemingway's old home, they headed for the exit. Eva was excited to get back and have Jake work on the map, but she was also eager to put in a call to Jerome regarding Sarah. While she hated to admit it, she didn't fully trust the young woman. Was she telling the truth about her identity? Eva had gained a bit more information about her at dinner, but when she talked about her first 2 years of college and then dropping out to do other things, well, it felt as if Sarah hadn't been fully forthright with her. If there was a chance she was trying to scam Eva, or she hadn't fully paid for her crimes as she'd hinted at, Eva needed to know that before considering any type of job opportunity. They left the exit gate, and Eva was looking for a cab to hail when a man approached them. He wore a ratty jacket and hadn't bathed in days, but the only thing that drew Eva's attention was the knife he held out at them. "Give me the map." Geraldine gasped and took a step back. Give it to me and I won't hurt you. Hands shaking, Eva reached into her purse. Easy now, the man said, stepping closer so that passers-by couldn't see the knife. What are you doing? Eva asked, swallowing hard around her fear. For the life of her, she couldn't find the map, though she'd slipped it into her tote minutes before. Just give me the map and I'm out of here. Hurry up, lady. Did someone put you up to this? She asked, her fingers finally landing on the old paper of the map. Just hand it over, he said, the knife coming dangerously close to Eva's side. I'm going to faint, Geraldine said, staggering. Knock it off, old lady, the guy said. I'll be out of here before you know it. Eva finally pulled the map free and handed it over to the man, who shoved it roughly into his coat pocket. And stashing the knife in a sheath at his hip, he rushed off across the street to blaring horns. Goodness, Geraldine said, her hand resting against her heart. Are you all right? Eva asked the older woman. I don't know. Geraldine staggered, and Eva helped her to a bench, her phone already in her hand and dialing Jerome. It'll be okay, Eva said, despite her shaky hands. And it would be. They were unharmed, and that's what mattered. That, and a little foresight. Oh, Eva! Geraldine turned teary eyes to the woman. We got our map. We're lost now. Then, despite the circumstances, Eva allowed a small smile. I wouldn't say that. The familiar smell of stale coffee and printer ink assaulted Eva as they stepped into the police station. Geraldine had insisted they go straight to the police rather than call them to the area since the man was long gone. Before they left, Eva had asked around to see if anyone had noticed the man before or after the incident. Frustratingly, no one had seen anything, and they'd finally left in a cab. Now, sitting across from Jerome, Eva could tell he was unhappy. You should have called us, or at least called me, he said, staring hard at Eva. Well, in my defense, I started to, Eva stuttered. But Geraldine insisted we come here. It's her map, after all. While it was a low blow and not exactly relevant, Jerome didn't press the point. Instead, he sent Geraldine off with a sketch artist to describe the man and turned to face Eva. This is all related, isn't it? She leaned back in her chair. I don't know, and I'm not just saying that. She filled him in on the whole process of Geraldine bringing the box to the bed and breakfast, of Mr. Anderson appearing to pay overly close attention to their conversation, and then how the events that followed could or could not have been related to the box. But this pin, that's an interesting thing, he said, frowning. By then, Geraldine was walking back with the sketch artist. They planned to show it to Eva to see if she had any changes before distributing it through the officers to see if anyone might find the man. The artist held out the black and white sketch, and Eva gasped. He had a pin, too? She turned to Geraldine. You didn't see it, the older woman said, brows arched. No, but I was very focused on the knife. I tend to notice strange things in turbulent situations. During a hurricane once, Geraldine, Eva said, drawing her friend back to the task at hand. Oh, right. But yes, it was just beneath the lapel of that ratty jacket. I think I noticed it because it was so out of place. I've never seen anything like it, Jerome admitted. The sketch artist agreed he hadn't either. Eva said the same, though she added she'd only just begun to look into it. The worst part is they have the map now, Geraldine said, tossing up her hands in a gesture of giving up. All is lost. But it's not, Eva said, placing her hand on the older woman's arm. I made a copy of it. And you're just telling me now? Geraldine looked hurt. First of all, you were in no condition to be having a conversation about the map. And then I figured it might be best to talk about it in an area that was safe. Geraldine looked around. I see. I think perhaps you're right. Back to the crime, Jerome cut in. They went over it one more time, Eva and Geraldine both giving as many details as they could. When they finished, he wrote a few more lines before putting his pen down. A pin is a flimsy clue, Jerome admitted, but that and a phone number is really all we have to go on. What phone number? Eva asked. A tech got back to me about Mr. Anderson's phone. Somehow it had been wiped, but he was able to recover one number. Just one, Geraldine said, incredulous. Just one. And it was for a window washing company in North Carolina. That's odd, Eva said. Not as odd as the fact that the company doesn't exist. I looked into it, and there's nothing real about this company. It's a front, Geraldine said dramatically. Something like that, Jerome said, trying to hide his smile. Either way, it's the next step in this. Okay, I've got to get this out to the officers on the street, but I'll have someone drive you ladies back. They protested, but he insisted. Then I'd like you to look into the pin, Eva. Me? Really? He nodded. Yes. Let me know if you run into any walls. I will. She stood, clutching her bag, and feeling as if she'd accomplished something, though she wasn't exactly sure what. They were just about to leave when she remembered Sarah. Pausing while Geraldine walked with the officer Jerome had called, she quickly explained the situation and handed him a slip of paper with the woman's name on it. Not sure what I can do, he said, looking from it to her, but I'll run the name. Thank you, she said, turning to go. Be careful, Eva. I mean it, Jerome said as she left. She waved a hand in recognition of his warning, but it wasn't needed. She knew the situation was escalating. Things had gone from curious to worrisome in the span of days, which only meant that, while they were on the right track, they had to be even more cautious about everything they did. There was no telling what danger lurked around the next bend. Chapter 9. Time really did fly when things were happening. Eva had been busy ever since the mugging at Knife Point. While it wasn't on the things that truly mattered, the map, the pin, or who Mr. Anderson might have been meeting with at Coffee Cabana, it was all things that had to be done. She'd heard back quickly from Jerome regarding Sarah Fisk. Surprisingly, she was in fact who she claimed to be. She'd been in trouble with the law a few times, but, as she'd stated, she had done her part to make up for that. In some cases, community service, and in one case, a short jail stay. Regardless, now she seemed to be on the straight and narrow. There had been no real record of her in the legal system for 3 years, and up until 6 months ago, she'd been employed as a waitress in New Jersey. Records showed that her mother, Megan Fisk, had passed away a year prior, and that Sarah's father was not registered on her birth certificate. Of course, while Sarah was indeed who she said she was, that didn't mean she wasn't trying to play Eva. Eva hated thinking that way, and normally she wouldn't have even gone there mentally, but the odd way in which the young woman had shown up set off some warning bells in Eva's mind. Not to mention their strange, almost coincidental history with the same man. Still, she'd remained a woman of her word. She was now helping Sarah find an apartment in town, and Eva had hired her on as a part-time maid to help at the bed and breakfast. While Elena had initially been worried about losing income, Eva had assured her that her hours would not change with the new hire. It had only been a few days that Sarah had worked at the bed and breakfast, and already she was invaluable. It was something Eva hadn't seen coming, but Sarah got along with everyone, including staff and guests. She was kind, friendly, helpful, and she looked professional in her uniform. When Eva had asked, she'd admitted that before her one stint in jail, she'd worked at a golf resort where she'd learned how to treat guests the right way and how to serve. Eva continued to tell her how thankful she was for her help, but she didn't stop keeping an eye on the girl. It wasn't paranoia so much as it was concern for her and Eva's own business. Now, however, Eva came back from a quick shopping trip to find Sarah as pale as a sheet. "What's wrong?" she asked, as the young woman came straight to her. "Well, I was manning the front desk as you'd asked, and this guy came in. He looked creepy." Eva nodded for her to continue. "He asked to see the belongings of a guy named Mr. Anderson. I told him I didn't know anything about this guest. I checked the logs, like you said, and then he started yelling at me to let him see the gray room." Sarah stared at Eva wide-eyed and continued. "I wasn't about to let him do that, but just when I thought he might actually come across the desk and strike me, Anton came in." She let out a held breath. "He made the guy leave and told me to call the police if he came back. He didn't, but man, I'm shaken. Oh, goodness." Eva pictured the man from before and described him to Sarah, who agreed they sounded like the same man. Hearing of his temper, Eva wondered if he'd been the same man to poison Mr. Anderson. "Are you all right?" she asked as Sarah leaned back into the desk chair. "Yeah, like I said, I'm shaken, but he didn't hurt me. I'm really glad Anton was here." "I'll have to go thank him," Eva said, thinking the man deserved a raise. "I think he had to run some errands, but Jake is here. He's just fixing the Wi-Fi signal upstairs, but he said to call out for him if I need him. Sounds like they're tag teaming as our security." Eva said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Is it always like this around here? Sarah asked. That drew a small laugh from Eva. No, it is nothing like this around here. Most of the time it's boring. She pressed her lips together and realized how that wasn't exactly true. But sometimes things do happen. She decided to fill Sarah in on what had been happening regarding Mr. Anderson. By the time she was done, Sarah looked as if she needed to sit down, even though she already was. I understand if you feel like you'd like to leave. Oh, gosh, no. Sarah shook her head, sitting up straighter. I mean, yeah, this is way out of my league, but hey, I'm here for it. I'm here to help. She dropped her gaze from Eva's, and Eva thought she caught the hint of a blush on the young woman's cheeks. What is it, Sarah? I've been running for a long time. Like, not from something, but maybe from myself? She shrugged as if she realized that didn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, when I saw your picture, I thought maybe this could be a great place to stop running. I know we don't really know one another, but I think you're the closest thing to family I've got. The silence sat between them for a moment. Eva was overwhelmed at the thought, and Sarah seemed to feel embarrassed she'd shared that much. I don't mean to say you owe me anything or something, Sarah finally said. Just that I'd like a place to belong, and for now, here's as good as any. Eva rushed to assure the young woman. I understand. I didn't think you were speaking out of turn. I think I was just surprised by the idea of family. I haven't had one in so long, and I'd like to. They shared a small smile, and then Jake came back down the stairs, breaking up the moment. Still, Eva took the young woman's words to heart. It would be nice for her to find a place of belonging here.
Pretty bird gets a treat.
Sarah smiled and offered the almond to Poirot, giggling when he took it from between her fingers. They had been working diligently on behind-the-scenes work for the bed and breakfast and were taking a short break. How long have you had him? Sarah asked. About 5 years now, Eva said, making him shake his wing before he got another treat. He's quite the character. Sarah laughed. He is. Eva checked her watch. She was expecting Ruben, but he was late, again, and she had a larger group checking in any minute. Everything all right? Sarah asked. Yes, I just have a lot on my mind. Why don't you take a break? I can check in that group that's coming, and when the contractor gets here, you can work with him. Eva smiled back at the young woman and nodded her head. You know what? That would be nice. Are you sure you don't mind? Mind? Sarah shook her head back and forth. Are you kidding? You found me a place to stay, put me up in a hotel, and gave me a job. I think it's the least I could be doing for you right now. Like I've told you, you don't need to worry about all that. Family helps each other out. Sarah's smile grew as she pushed Eva gently toward a chair. Eva was about to obey when a thought occurred. She hadn't had a chance to truly study the map since she'd had Jake scan it and print out additional copies. Now they had several on hand, including an extra copy in the safe. Once again, she was grateful she'd had the foresight to do that since the map was stolen. Let me grab something first.
Let's take a walk,
Poirot said. He wants to get on your shoulder, Eva told Sarah. He does that? Sometimes, but I usually only let him on my shoulder and not for very long. He likes to chew earrings and can get a bit ornery. Sorry, Poirot, not today, Sarah said.
Pretty bird,
was his reply. Eva went to the safe and opened it, pulling out one version of the map. She'd been sure to include all of the markings that they'd discovered by lining it up with the penny, and now she could see the front and back depending on which side she looked at since she'd printed them front to back. She poured herself a glass of iced tea from the fridge in the kitchen and made her way to the secluded spot on the back porch to look over the maps. Resting on the wicker furniture with soft cushions at her back, she started with the original side and a map of the Florida Keys from her phone. Zooming in and out, she couldn't tell a clear connection. She saw where the X marked what she assumed was the end spot on the map, but she couldn't determine if it fit over any existing landscape in the area. As she observed the copy, she clenched her jaw. It wasn't fair that the original had been stolen. It would have been invaluable to study with the watermark of the penny. Of course, they still had the directions, but that wouldn't help if there were other watermarks she'd missed. Then again, she had studied it fairly well, and was sure she would have seen something. She flipped the map over and began looking at it that way. She made light marks where the compass was, transposing them to the back. But would they remain in their exact locations, or would they too be swapped? She tried it one way at first, flipping the west to where it indicated east and vice versa, but nothing looked like a better fit. She tried zooming even further out this time, but still no corresponding landmarkers fit. Sighing, Eva set the map on the coffee table with a book on top so as not to let it fly away. Then she pulled out her phone again and opened a search bar. She typed in a description of the odd pin that Mr. Anderson had been wearing and began to go down that rabbit hole. At first, she was making even less progress than she'd done with the map, but then her eye caught on an image of the exact pin. With a slight tremor to her fingers, she tapped on the link and was disappointed to find that the article had been taken down. What was so important about this pin that it warranted such secrecy? Or was she looking for secrets where there were none? She was about to give up completely and perhaps close her eyes until Ruben arrived when the back door opened. Geraldine and Willard came through, making a beeline to her spot. Willard rubbed his hands together as if he had just seen treasure at the sight of the map on the table. He was about to reach for it, but Geraldine held out her hand. "Hold it," she said, eyes honing in on Ava's weary features. "What have you found out?" "Nothing," Eva said with an uncharacteristic dramatic flair. "I'm going to lose my mind with this map and this pin." "Oh, the pin I saw the thief wearing." Geraldine took a seat across from Eva, and Willard scooted to the other side of the love seat where Eva sat, likely so he could have access to the map over her shoulder. "One and the same," Eva admitted, pulling up the main image of it again. Willard leaned over her shoulder. "Why are you looking into the Holmes Society?" Eva and Geraldine both turned to the older man. Eva spoke first. "What? What's the Holmes Society?" "That's what the wearers of those pins call themselves. The Holmes Society, same as a secret society like the Masons." Ava's heart began to pound. Somehow, the last person she would have expected to know anything about their current predicament was the one person she needed to talk to about the pin. She felt like shouting Eureka as if she'd struck gold, but instead she said, "Willard, tell me everything you know about the Holmes Society." Chapter 10. "How do you know anything about this, Willard?" Geraldine asked, leaning forward in the chair across from them. "I might have been a member," he said, looking down as if he were ashamed. "Oh, really?" Eva said, sounding excited. "Yes." "Why do you look like you're ashamed of that fact?" Geraldine said. She wore a gold skirt and gold sandals with a white top. Her gold hoops and gold eyeshadow glinted in the sunlight as she narrowed her eyes at him. "It was a bit kooky." He rubbed at his jaw. "How so?" Eva said, fully intrigued now. "Well, they made you do this oath thing when you became a member, and it was all very secret society, so there was a handshake and a phrase you had to say. Plus," now he cleared his throat, "they're all treasure hunters." "Treasure?" Eva and Geraldine said at the same time. Yes." He looked between them, obviously confused at their overly enthusiastic interest. "That would explain it," Geraldine said. "Explain what?" Willard asked. "It would." "But both men, they looked so different," Eva mused. "What men? Who looked different?" Eva smiled at Willard, his confusion still evident. She took mercy on him and explained what had happened the last few days and how they'd run into two separate men who'd worn the pin he recognized. She then shared about the map they'd found and how they'd been robbed at knife point. "Goodness," he said, leaning back in the seat. "You ladies need to be careful." "We didn't seek out the trouble, Willard. We just found ourselves a part of it." Geraldine reached forward and took the map, examining it much the same way that Eva had, front and back. "Please, Willard, tell me more about the society," Eva encouraged. "Right. Well," he shrugged, his eyes moving to mid-stance in thought. "As I said, it's basically a society for treasure hunters. They call themselves Holmes after Sherlock Holmes, but it's not about crime, which was the reason I'd first joined it." Eva nodded. That made sense. She'd first met Willard after she'd placed an advertisement at the local library for the murder mystery book club she wanted to start. It was before there was an MMBC, and she'd been passionate about finding other local mystery lovers to share that love with. The very next day after she'd posted, he'd reached out expressing his interest in joining. Sadly, his wife Bonnie was too squeamish to be involved with such a group. She was a romance lover, and had joined a book club for that. But now Willard was a die-hard mystery fan who loved solving crimes before the end of the book, if he could, and he'd jumped at the chance to join her book club. Seeing him joining a home society made sense. If she'd known about such a thing, she'd likely have wanted to join as well, but she would have been in for a shock just like Willard. If they focused more on the treasure hunting, then what was Mr. Anderson from Virginia doing in Key West as a part of this group? She asked Willard about their attendance, and he expanded. There's a meeting every fall. This isn't just some small group that meets in Key West. There are groups like this all over the U.S., though they tend to center where there has been mention of treasure in the past. But they meet up here. Certain chapters, I believe. I know the one that meets here is more focused on water treasure rather than buried treasure. Things like recovering sunken ship treasure? She asked. From what I know, yes. I wasn't really a part of the society long enough to truly be inducted. They have a long vetting process to make sure you aren't just in it to get info and split. When I found out all the hoops you had to go through, I wasn't willing to stick around for that. Like what? Geraldine asked, looking up from the map. Like getting certified as a scuba diver, for one thing. Get me on a boat to fish and I'm there, but I'm not getting out in shark-infested waters. He shivered. Eva smiled. Despite the fact that he was much more likely to be in a car accident than a shark attack, she could understand his logic. Scuba diving wasn't for everyone. What else can you tell me about the organization? Eva asked, hoping to discover something more that might help with the investigation. She already had more to tell Jerome, and for that she was grateful. Not much, he admitted, shrugging. They were a bit wacko, like I said, but they didn't discriminate on who could join. I mean, for as thorough as they were in the process of joining, anyone could join as long as you knew someone who was a member. And they had a whole bunch of these secret codes. Wait, how did you join then? Eva asked. I knew a guy. He was an acquaintance, really, but I got to know him when we did a poker night at the golf club. After one too many cocktails, he started talking about this secret society he was in. Most guys weren't interested, but you know my penchant for a good mystery. You got the truth out of him, Eva said with a smile. Exactly. So he was your introduction? Yeah. And then they started teaching me the codes, and as smart as I am about mysteries, none of it made sense. How so? Eva asked. It wasn't based on ciphers I knew or anything like that. It was, call this number at this time, then take that info and call the next number, and after 3 or 4 calls, you finally knew where the next meeting was. Numbers. That made Eva think of the number they had found on Mr. Anderson's phone. Did they ever have you call a dry cleaner's? Willard frowned. I suppose so, but it was different every time. Eva slumped back. So the number might be a dead end. And they were specific to what you needed to know. I remember that every time I called for the smaller meeting, not everyone would meet at the same time. I always got this Thai food place. Bonnie hated it, because I'd always have a hankering for Thai food after that. Geraldine rolled her eyes, but dropped the map to her lap. There's nothing here. What is it? A treasure map? Can I see? Willard looked excitedly between them. Knock yourself out, Geraldine said, shoving it toward him. Eva was frustrated that the phone number could turn out to be a dead end. If Mr. Anderson was supposed to call several other numbers after that first one, and had only called one of them, it was possible the chain had been broken, and they'd never know the reason behind his call. Or, if it had been a one-time call, they still couldn't break the code without inside help. You said you knew a man who was part of the society? She asked Willard. He looked up from the map and nodded. Still know him. We're not close, but I see him a few times a year at the club. We may need to use that connection. Hola! The voice boomed from the other side of the white curtains that separated Ava's space from the rest of the backyard. Ruben? She said, sitting up. She checked her watch to see he was almost 30 minutes late. Back here. Yes, hello, he said, poking his head through the curtains. Are you ready to be in? Eva wanted to say something about the fact that he needed to wait for her to finish her conversation with her friends. She didn't even know why they'd stopped by, though she assumed it was regarding Geraldine's map, but Geraldine made a shooing motion. We'll sit here and chat while you take care of your business. Eva stood and sent them both a grateful smile, following Ruben back into the main room. There were a few guests scattered about in chairs, some reading and some enjoying an afternoon coffee from the self-serve bar. But thankfully, it looked like Sarah had gotten everyone checked in for their long weekend. "The white room, see?" "Yes, lead the way." They took the hallway back into the guest room hallway, and she opened the door to the white room. "Can you spare to have these under construction while the gray room is out of use?" he asked, surveying the room. Was this another stalling tactic to put off working on this room? If so, what was Ruben's adverse reaction to remodeling the room? Rather than let her frustration out, she put on a smile. "Not to worry. I will have the gray room back soon." "Oh? I'd heard, well, that it was not a pretty sight." It wasn't like there was blood. Who did you talk to? She narrowed her eyes. "Benita is a friend of the family," he said by way of explanation. Eva nodded. Elena was shocked to find Mr. Anderson, but there was nothing left for anyone to even know he'd died there. He'd not been there long enough. She made a face, and they both knew what she was saying. He hadn't started to decompose, thankfully. "I see. Will you tell future guests?" Ruben asked. "Not you two." She rolled her eyes. "It will be fine." She knew that there was no way he could know, at least not yet, that Mr. Anderson hadn't died of natural causes. It did seem a little underhanded not to mention, but it wasn't important. New guests wouldn't have to know. If it was Eva, she wouldn't want to know. Would she? "I see I've caused some thought, Dulcura," he said, tapping her light on the nose. She stepped back from the touch and looked around the room. "Why don't you start with the least invasive remodel aspects? Perhaps we'll wait on the bathroom redo until the winter season hits and I don't have quite so many guests." She shrugged. "Then again, who am I kidding? So many still want to come to escape the cold. I'll probably still be booked, but it might be easier for your crew." He laughed and nodded. "Okay, we will do the rest and wait to start the bathroom when you are ready." She wanted to say she was ready now, but she still sensed hesitation from him, and while it bothered her, she also trusted her intuition. Perhaps he had a lot on his plate and was fitting her in. Ruben had been a good friend, but she could tell that his feelings for her were getting in the way of their friendship, something that would have to be addressed, she was sure. For now, she'd keep fending off advances for anything more than friends, and be thankful for his excellent work and willingness to do the job. "Okay, we will get to work." "Thank you," she said, gently squeezing his hand. When he tried to hold her fingers longer, she pulled back and turned to the door. "Let me know if you need anything." And with a wave, she left him in the room. She had things to think through and a plan in which she needed the Murder Mystery Book Club's help. Thankfully, they'd be meeting the next day, and she'd be able to get their take on all the strange things that had been going on lately. In fact, it felt odd that they hadn't yet been involved in the case, but she'd respected Geraldine's claim to the map. Although after seeing her with Willard, she knew it was time for outside help. They needed to discover what Hemingway's treasure map held, and how Mr. Anderson had found himself involved in the first place. Chapter 11. The white curtains fluttered in a soft breeze, and the scent of fresh coffee and pumpkin scones drifted to Eva where she sat in the love seat. The other members of the Murder Mystery Book Club sat around her talking in smaller groups until she began the meeting. To her left, Elijah and Vicky were chatting about his latest trip, and then across from her, Willard and Geraldine were enjoying scones, though it looked to be Willard's second. Pete and Kay were focused on the mud at their feet, trying to get it to sit, though the dog looked stubbornly back at them. "Well, I think we're all here," Eva said, letting out a breath as she looked around the circle of her friends. "It's been too long since we've all been together," Willard said. "True," Eva said, twisting her hands nervously in her lap for the next thing she wanted to bring up. "And I was wondering if I may ask a favor of the group." A chorus of agreement went up, and Eva began to relax slightly. Sarah," she called back through the curtains. Sarah popped her head through, wide eyes taking in the group in front of her. "Come on in," Eva said, holding out a hand to her. Sarah sat next to Eva, and Eva began to explain. "This is Sarah Fisk. She and I have a bit of history, and she's just moved to Key West. She's working for me here at the B&B, but I was thinking it would be fun to add her to our club if you were all in agreement." Before she even finished the last word, everyone was nodding their head and saying yes. "We've needed new blood in here for too long," Willard was saying. "It's lovely to have you," Vicky said, though she already knew that Eva had planned to invite Sarah. "Welcome," Kay and Pete both said, the dog at their feet barking once as well. Everyone burst into laughter, and any tension Eva had felt was broken. She wasn't sure why she'd been nervous. She'd invited Jerome before, and though he'd only attended one meeting, everyone had been amenable. Perhaps it was the fact of who Sarah was to her, but she knew the group would be kind to her no matter her background. "Then let's jump into the book," Eva said. Sarah pulled out her tattered copy, already having read the book twice since Eva invited her to join. They erupted into conversation about the book, and immediately Sarah relaxed, going so far as to argue with Pete about the killer's motive. When the discussion finally died out, Geraldine met Ava's gaze with a slight nod. "And," Eva said, setting her book down, "another request." "Please say this is about the guy who died in the gray room," Elijah said. Vicky elbowed him and he let out a grunt. Eva caught Sarah's sharp intake of breath and plunged in. "Actually, it is. Though I'd better fill Sarah in on what we do here." Eva went on to explain a little of what they'd done in the past and how they'd used their combined powers of observation and investigation to solve past crimes. "So you're like a real-life crime club, huh?" "Oh, I like that," Geraldine said. Everyone laughed. "I wouldn't say it like that," Eva said. "But we do have keen minds that know quite a bit about crime thanks to our reading, and if it can help—" She shrugged, letting that be the end of what she was saying. "I get it. I'd like to help, but I don't know how I can. I mean, I'm only just starting to read mysteries." Sarah looked between Eva and the group. "You'll do just fine," Geraldine said, pulling a paper from her purse that Eva recognized as another copy, a larger version of the map. "And we're going to start with a treasure hunt." "Yes!" Willard said, his smile widening. "This is more up my alley," Kay said, leaning forward. "But there was a murder, too," Pete said, looking between Eva and Geraldine. "Why don't you fill them in?" Geraldine said to Eva. So she did. She told them how Geraldine had come to her with a box and how Mr. Anderson had been there while they'd been talking, and then she shared about the break-ins to the bed and breakfast, but how nothing had been taken, at least the first time. Then she went on to explain about the pin, the secret society, giving a nod to Willard, and then finally to the fact that Mr. Anderson had died of poisoning, but in a strange way. "I've never really heard of someone dying from taking too many anticoagulants," Vicky added. "That is odd," Elijah agreed. "So you can see that we think the map is linked to Mr. Anderson, and perhaps the secret society since they sent a man to hold us up at knife point," Geraldine said, looking affronted at the fact. "And I think it all must come back to the treasure." "You mean alleged treasure?" Elijah pointed out. "Well, yes, that." She unfolded the map, her arthritic fingers smoothing it out across the coffee table. "But this has to be part of it. It would be too coincidental, right? It does seem odd that you'd find this map and then the man who happened to be eavesdropping would wind up dead." Pete shot a look to Kay, who had given up on getting the dog to sit. "They always say you can't pass too much off as coincidence." Kay nodded and turned to look at Eva. "What I don't understand is who would kill that poor old man." Eva thought back to the video Jerome had showed her. "I'm not sure, but he knew where the cameras were and—" Eva blinked. Something had just occurred to her when she thought back to her time at the cafe. Either this man had scoped out the place in advance, or— "What is it, Eva?" Sarah asked. "I know that look," Geraldine said. A chorus of Me Toos went up around the circle, and Eva smiled back at her friends. "I was just thinking that it's possible the killer had been here before, or is possibly from here." "How'd you get to that?" Vicky asked. She explained about the video and then said, "But it's more than that. We went to that coffee shop and—" "Who's we?" Pete asked. "Jerome and I," she said quickly. "And something just struck me." "Out with it," Willard said. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, with a look of excitement flashing in his eyes. "When we left, I saw a waitress resetting our table. I didn't think anything of it at the time, except that she deserved a good tip, but it strikes me now that we'd seen the table just the way Jerome had set it up. He pulled over a chair, he positioned the table, etc. I don't know that someone who hadn't been there on more than one occasion would know they could do that with that particular table." The guy would have had to pull over a chair and position everything just so in order to not be in the line of sight of the camera. So he's a hacker? Kay suggested. Or he knows someone who gave him a heads up about the camera, Eva said. I realize that doesn't make him from here, but it could be someone who's familiar with the local cafes. I have a thought, Sarah said, sounding timid. Go ahead, Eva encouraged. Well, I was just thinking, and if what you said is true, if Mr. Anderson's part in all of this is due to the box in the map, then it seems awfully quick for him to be poisoned by someone who just happens to come to town. Pete looked at Eva. You should ask Detective Makos if he can find out more about Mr. Anderson's background, Pete suggested. Perhaps there's something in his past that followed him down here and it has nothing to do with the box. Perhaps, Eva admitted, though she didn't know if she could see the two things happening simultaneously as they had. It is odd, though, that we'd be targeted by a member of the Holmes Society, something Mr. Anderson was a part of as well, and then to have him poisoned. It's all mingled together somehow. What's our next move? Willard asked as he reached for his coffee. We are going to meet with your Holmes contact tomorrow morning, correct? Eva asked. He nodded and she continued. Someone should try going back one more time to the antique pop-up, and I think someone needs to talk to the workers at the coffee cabana to see if anyone has asked for access to their cameras anytime recently. And I've got a friend who could take a look at the map, Pete offered. He's a big treasure-hunting buff. Eva looked around the circle and could sense everyone's willingness to help. Why don't we do this? She looked around again, and her gaze landed on Kay. Would you go with Geraldine to the pop-up on Sunday, Kay? I'd be happy to, she said with a bright smile. Great. Then, Pete, why don't you and Elijah take the map to your contact? Willard and I will keep that appointment tomorrow. And, Sarah, would you and Vicky mind going to the cafe to ask around? I think it may take both of you working independently until you find something. Sure, Sarah said, looking at Vicky to see what she'd said. I'd love to, Vicky said. Let's do it. Tomorrow? If we all can, let's meet Sunday afternoon and share notes, Eva suggested. Everyone nodded and seemed to sit back with a contented smile. Eva felt good as well. Things weren't clearing up exactly, but she always felt better when she had a plan. Well then, Willard slapped his hands on his knees. How about another scone? Everyone laughed as he reached for another pastry, and Eva felt some of the tension of not knowing what to do ease. While it didn't erase the fact that a man had been killed in her bed and breakfast, having friends like these sure did help. Saturday morning dawned bright with a haze on the horizon that she assumed might signify a storm later that afternoon. Still, it was a beautiful day, and she felt hopeful that she, Willard, and Elijah could find some answers about this odd secret club and Mr. Anderson's involvement in it. She did wonder how upfront the man would be with them. Would he be willing to offer them answers? Or would he push the truth off, as so many societies like to do? Eva was getting ready to head out of the main building, the brunch crowd bustling around in the waiting area, which was basically the whole front room of the bed and breakfast, when she spotted Jerome with 2 cups of coffee in hand. What are you doing here? She said, smiling as he offered her a cup. Thought I'd come by to see you and bring coffee. Foolish of me, seeing as you have one of the most popular brunch spots in Key West in your front room. She smiled, accepting the coffee and taking a sip. Hazelnut and sweet vanilla flavors rushed around her mouth. This is good. Thought you might like that. And there is no way our little brunch spot is the most popular in Key West, she said with a laugh. We're just small, and Anton knows everyone, so we're always booked. Nope. He held up a hand as they both sidestepped to avoid a couple who just walked in. It's one of the most popular spots. I tried to get a reservation, booked out for 4 months. 4 months, Eva. She giggled, the pleasure of knowing he was interested in coming to their brunch filling her. I'd be happy to get you a reservation any time. I do know the chef, she said with a giggle that was much too girlish for the morning hour. Usually I wouldn't accept insider help, but if you agree to join me, then it would be okay, I think. She couldn't help the smile that washed over her this time. He wanted her to accompany him? I'd be... Hola, dulzura! Eva startled, turning around to see Ruben and 2 other men with paint cans and drop cloths behind him. Oh, hello, Ruben. Senor, Ruben said to Jerome. It sounded cold to Eva, but he turned back to her. We are ready to start painting. Okay, you still have the keycard, right? Yes. He patted the breast pocket of his shirt. Great, I'll be out for a while. Eva noticed Ruben shot Jerome a look, and she could almost see his thinking written on his handsome Cuban features. "With Willard," she added, "but I'm eager to see your progress when I get back." He looked somewhat mollified and dipped his head to her before shooing the young men toward the guest hallway. "Where are you going this morning?" Jerome asked. He seemed to have sidestepped his request for brunch, and she thought that perhaps, for now, that was best. "Actually," she blushed, realizing what they were doing, "I'm going to talk to a member of the Home Society. It's about the pen." Jerome hesitated. "I know I asked you to look into it, but researching on the computer is different from going and putting yourself in danger." She shifted uncomfortably, sipping the delicious coffee as a distraction. "But Willard is coming with me, and I'm coming too." "You are?" "Eva." Jerome tilted his head to the side. "You have to ask? If there's even a remote possibility of danger, I'm coming." "The man's a friend of Willard's. I highly doubt he's going to pull a knife on two of us. I'd rather not risk it. Shall we?" He held out his arm to her as if he were escorting her to a fancy dinner, and all she could do was release a sigh and accept his offer. Perhaps there was a small part of her that was thankful he was coming, though. While she trusted Willard in the fact that he knew this man, you never knew what could happen. Perhaps his contact told others he was meeting with people about the society. It was definitely possible. Maybe Jerome was right, and it would be best to have a detective with them. Jerome hailed a cab for them, and she gave the address to a small cafe on the other side of town from her bed and breakfast. Then she turned to Jerome, assessing what he was wearing. Being off-duty, he had on blue jeans, a polo that looked more at home to a golf tournament, and white tennis shoes. He also wore a pair of sunglasses. In all, the look spoke of relaxation, not police. That was good. "What?" he said. She realized she'd been staring and explained her thoughts. "I don't know what this man will do if he thinks the police are involved." "So you're saying I should go undercover for this operation?" There was laughter behind his words, but she paid it no mind. "I do. I think it would be best for all involved." "Whatever you say, Detective Stewart." She made a face at him, but the cab was already pulling up to the cafe. "Here we go," she said, climbing out ahead of him. Willard walked up to them, side-eyeing Jerome as he began talking to Eva. "I told him we'd grab a table. He's running late." As you can see, Jerome decided to join. "I can see that." Willard turned toward him. "Detective." "Just Jerome for today," he said, offering a handshake of welcome. "Right, well, okay then." He gave a look to Eva that said, "If you think this is best." Then they turned to enter the cafe. The scents of coffee and freshly baked pastries wafted their way, and Eva was glad she hadn't had much breakfast. Anton always provided an early breakfast for the bed and breakfast guests who didn't want to join in for brunch, and she'd taken part of that breakfast hours ago. But a chocolate-filled croissant and another small cup of coffee sounded wonderful. They took seats, and Eva found her foot tapping. Where was Willard's contact? "He is coming, right?" she asked. "Yeah, Henry is known for being late," Willard said, eyeing his watch. "You don't think he decided not to come, do you?" Eva asked, sending a nervous glance at Jerome. "Nah, he's one of those guys who does things on his own terms, you know," Willard said, studying the menu. Soon the waitress came and they all made their orders. Then the door opened and a tall, wiry man stepped in. He wore an Avengers t-shirt under a striped button-up. His pants were dark-washed blue jeans. While he looked to be somewhere in his mid-40s, Eva thought he was going for a youthful look as part of his persona. "Hey, you will," he said, coming up to the table and giving each of them a once-over. "Thought you said it was just us and your lady friend." He had the gall to waggle his eyebrows at Eva, and she thought she sensed Jerome tensing next to her, but she spoke up to her own defense. "This is our friend Jerome. Thanks for meeting with us, Henry." "Whatever," Henry said, sitting down next to Willard. "You're paying, Willman." Eva pressed her lips at the man's tone. He was bordering on rude, but Willard rolled his eyes at her as if to assure her he was used to this type of treatment from Henry. They explained a little about who they were to the strange man after he'd placed his order, Jerome saying something about spending his weekends scuba diving, and then Henry jumped into what they were all interested in. "So, Will here told you about the society, huh?" "We're definitely interested. What can you tell us about it?" Eva said, gently prodding him. "Not a whole lot, rules and all, but I can tell you what I told Will here. It was started years ago by a few fanatics who loved treasure-seeking. Down here is the right place to be for that sort of thing, you know? Lots of buried and sunken treasure." "You found some?" Jerome asked, licking berry jam from the corner of his mouth. Not me, but some of the guys have. I'm not as hardcore as them. So if someone's a member, there's some sort of meetup at this time of year, Jerome said. He did it in such a way as to not draw undue attention to his question, but Eva was surprised by the boldness of it anyway. Yeah, same time as a pop-up antique market every year, something about convenience. Eva shared a look with Jerome. And what happens? They go treasure hunting, look through the antiques for clues? I mean, I'm not getting the full picture, Henry. Eva made sure to offer him her full attention, and it seemed to loosen his tongue somewhat. The guys that are hardcore spend the rest of the year searching. They look for rumors of lost treasure or something to make connections down here in Key West or the other keys. It turns into this big old thing, and if they find something that's worth it, they might sell it at the market. But sometimes it goes into a private collection or is sold online. Right, so do they meet more regularly during this time of year? We did, he said, shoving a large bite of a muffin into his mouth. But then that other group showed up, and we had to get creative with our meeting spots. What other group? Eva and Jerome said at the same time. She shared a look with him, and he deferred to her. I thought it was just the Home Society. Oh, it was. It was our thing, but I think one of the funding members of the HS, that's what we call it, got the short end of some deal and got all mad about it, so he went and made his own group. Let me get this straight, Jerome said, leaning forward on the table. There's not just one secret society, but two operating right here in Key West, and they're all about treasure hunting. Henry held up a hand. Don't make it sound like we're so crazy. He made a face. We meet here once a year, but the rest of the time we do online forums, video conferencing stuff, and members will go off and do their own thing, like any other club. Surprisingly, that's not the part I'm having trouble believing, Jerome said. I'm still stuck on the fact that there are two of these groups. We're kind of more like rivals, really, Henry said, finishing off his muffin. The guys who had the falling out do not like one another. Enough to harm members of the rival faction? Eva asked. Henry started, but then stopped as if he wasn't sure how to proceed. What is it? Eva pressed. Go on, Henry, Willard said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Tell them what they need to know. Yeah, I guess it's okay to tell you guys this. You're gonna flip, though. How so? Jerome asked. Well, I overheard our leader, his name's Boyd, talking about how there was a rogue agent down here. What does that mean? Jerome asked. We call ourselves agents. It's dumb. Henry rolled his eyes. But I think the old guys like it. He winked at Willard before continuing. And somehow Boyd thinks that one of the guys got a big tip. He called in muscle from up the coast, and what does that mean? Eva asked. Muscle. Like buff guys to come down and act like security or something. We do that occasionally if there's a really hot dig and there might be people trying to get their hands on it. We hire out since we're never really sure who works for who down here. So a call went out for this muscle, and what? They come down here and bust some heads? Jerome asked. Nah, man, nothing that bold. Just, protect whoever called them. Do what they say. Stuff like that. Okay, and then what? Well, Boyd was saying he hadn't heard from that particular agent, Agent 564, and he was getting worried. Since he wasn't the one to hire the muscle, they won't talk with him or anything. What's all this got to do with the map we found and the HS poking their nose into private business? Willard asked. Look, I don't know. Will here told me about the guy who held up the ladies and how he was wearing our pin, but honestly, he doesn't sound like any of our members. He chugged some of his Coke. But I'll tell you what this does kind of sound like, at least with the mention of Hemingway, is Boyd's former partner. Who was that? Jerome pressed. It was before my time, man. I don't know. Jerome was obviously frustrated, but he hid it well. Can you get us in contact with Boyd? You can talk to him if you get a hold of him. What does that mean? Jerome asked. He's out of the country. Why did he leave? Jerome leaned forward, and Eva wondered if she should nudge him gently. He was treating awfully close to detective-like questioning. Work, I guess. He does something that takes him overseas pretty regularly. When did he leave? Eva asked before Jerome could. At least a week ago. Maybe 2. He was bummed to miss this year's meetup, but he said the job couldn't be skipped. Interesting. Jerome leaned back in his chair, and Eva sensed they'd gotten what they could from Henry. Still, as they talked about other aspects of the Home Society that didn't seem to coincide with the case, Ava's mind wandered. There was a rivalry between 2 men, Boyd and the mysterious partner. But if Boyd was out of the country now, it stood to reason that he hadn't been involved with Mr. Anderson's death. Or if he had, he'd arranged it from out of the country, which in and of itself sounded unlikely. Do you know a man named Abe Anderson? Eva asked, startling everyone. She hadn't realized they'd switched topics and all eyes turned to her. Yeah? Henry nodded. Tall guy, old, kind of obsessive. How so? He started coming to our meetings a long time ago. Was convinced he'd hit it big and be set for retirement, but that hasn't happened. At least not yet. Know anything else about him? Jerome asked. Nope. It was clear that was all they were going to get from Henry, but Eva wondered if it was enough to steer them in a different, perhaps more productive, direction. She looked forward to talking with Jerome to hear his thoughts. Chapter 12. Sunday morning came and went with extra attention afforded to a couple who wanted to check in earlier than their 11 o'clock time frame. Eva was more than happy to accommodate when possible, and it turned out that their room had been vacated earlier that morning. Now she was sipping a late afternoon coffee and waiting for her friends to arrive. She'd promised them an alfresco dinner by the pool and was thankful that guests had mostly chosen to go out that night. She didn't mind using her own outdoor space for small parties, but she did try to only do so when she wasn't fully booked. That wasn't the case this weekend, but she figured it couldn't hurt to have a small party next to her cottage. The pool would still be open for guests, but as of that moment, none were there. I've got the rest ready to go when they arrive, Sarah said, untying a slightly dirty white apron from around her thin waist. You are a lifesaver, Eva said, smiling up at the young woman. Sarah had offered to coordinate the dinner of caprese salad, roasted chicken, green beans, and baked potatoes. It was the easiest dinner Eva had ever thrown, and she'd happily offered to set up the fold-out tables. They were now covered with white linen tablecloths, flickering white candles in silver bases, and folded white napkins at each place setting. This table looks amazing, Sarah said. I feel like I stepped into a home magazine or something. Eva felt the light blush on her cheeks and turned back to add a few white blossoms she'd picked from the garden. Boss might not be too happy the next day, but she'd smooth him over with one of the brownies she'd made for tonight. Thank you. I just like to host when I can. I can tell. Sarah slipped into a chair and looked back at Eva. So this is really your life, huh? Eva laughed. What does that mean? Just that it seems too good to be true. Did you miss the part where a man was found dead in my bed and breakfast? I didn't mean that. Sarah made a face. Just that you get to live here. She spread her arms, taking in the glowing bistro lights reflected against the aqua water of the pool, the white curtains on the deck flickering back and forth in the wind, and the plush lawn furniture that was even more comfortable than it looked. It's incredible. I am very blessed, Eva admitted. It is a lot of hard work to keep everything going, but I think my secret is the help I've hired to run this business with me. They're amazing, and you're becoming one of those very people. Thank you, again, Eva. It's like a dream working in this place. And my apartment, while not nearly as nice as this, is one of the best things I've ever had in my life. A place of my own? A place I can pay the rent on and enjoy? Don't thank me. You're doing all the work. I just helped here and there. Sarah's eyes narrowed, but as if sensing that Eva was slightly uncomfortable with the praise, she switched topics. You guys really do investigate murders, huh? Isn't that, like, creepy? Was what you did with Vicky creepy? Not at all. I mean, we got to kind of be all incognito, which was fun. We actually did talk to... Eva held up her hand. Don't tell me yet. We'll discuss it when we all have dinner. Sarah laughed. You guys really take this stuff seriously. If we're not meeting here, we usually do a monthly dinner out. Tonight we're just eating here so we can talk more candidly, but yes, we really do take it seriously. Mostly because while we enjoy the books we read and discuss, I think all of us know that real life is much more serious than fiction. Seems kind of obvious, Sarah said, though not unkindly. Of course. But I think it's rare to have a group like we do. People who genuinely want to help. Whether it's me in clearing my name, or the name of my bed and breakfast, or if it's something as simple as a lost item one of us has, we'll help. You're like your own type of little family. I suppose we are. And you're a part of us now. Sarah looked down, and while Eva didn't think the woman felt awkward about her statement, she certainly felt something. What is it, Sarah? The young woman finally looked up and met Eva's eyes. I haven't been completely honest about why I'm here. Eva's eyes widened, but she didn't speak, giving the woman space to share. I did want to come find you, and after being here, I really love it. My job is great, the apartment is perfect, you're perfect. She blushed and looked away. "But I really sought you out because I wanted to talk to you about—" "We're here!" Eva and Sarah looked up to see Kay and Pete coming down the steps with the same misbehaved dog. It looked cleaner, as if they'd given it a bath and perhaps a trim, and it seemed to be listening a little better as well. Given that it had just been 3 days, Eva thought that was progress. "Hello, come on down." Eva turned to Sarah. "Let's talk about this later, all right? For now, just enjoy the night." Sarah nodded. "And don't worry." Eva smiled and squeezed her on the shoulder as she walked by. "Whatever it is, we'll get past it." The young woman nodded again, and Eva went to greet Kay and Pete. Soon they were joined by Elijah carrying a few bottles of sparkling cider with Vicky in tow, Willard on her heels. Geraldine made a grand entrance, as usual, in a flowing gown of magenta silk and rhinestone-encrusted sandals. Behind her, Eva was most shocked to see Jerome walking down, a few baguettes in his arms. "You're here," she said, realizing the minute the words came out that they sounded odd. "I'm here." He grinned and offered her the bread. "Couldn't come empty-handed." "Thank you. This will be perfect with the meal." Sarah slipped up next to her and took the bread, winking behind Jerome's back as she rushed toward the kitchen. Choosing to ignore Sarah, Eva asked the obvious question. "Who invited you?" "Did you want me to leave?" "Of course not, but I'm curious." "Willard, actually." "Really?" Eva laughed, picturing how that must have gone. She wouldn't have suspected he cared that much about whether Jerome joined them or not. "I'd actually called to talk to him about his friend Henry, and we got to talking. He said I might as well come, since it was my case after all." Jerome offered her a devilish grin. "It is," she admitted. "And I would have invited you, but this is really just an extension of our book club, and, well..." She trailed off. She still felt uncomfortable about the fact that he'd only attended one meeting and never came back. "And what?" Jerome waited, then pressed when she didn't answer. "Ava, what is it?" "It's clear you didn't like our club, and—" "Wait a second, what do you mean, don't like?" She met his gaze so he'd see the truth of it in her eyes. "You came once, and never again. That's pretty clear." He frowned. "I thought it was a closed group." It was her turn to frown. "What do you mean, closed?" "I thought you opened it up for me to come that one night, but that was it." "I never said that. I'm sure I invited you to come again." "I'm pretty sure you didn't." They stood there, eye to eye, toe to toe, and she tried to remember when she'd invited him to their next meeting. She was nearly positive she had, but in the moment, with his swirling green eyes pouring into hers, it didn't seem to matter. "I'm sure I did invite you," she said, her voice coming out more breathy than she'd have liked. "On the small chance I didn't, here's your invitation, Detective Makos." The corner of his lips twitched, drawing her eyes there, but she quickly forced her gaze back to his. "Fine, Miss Stewart. We'll take this as your invite, and maybe I'll come to your next meeting." They held each other's gaze for a few seconds longer before Sarah came out the back door announcing dinner was served. "Fine," Eva said, stepping back and breaking whatever spell had been cast between them. "I'll believe it when I see it. Challenge accepted." He stepped back just as Sarah walked past with a platter of chicken, and their focus shifted to helping her get the food to the table. Throughout the night, Eva couldn't help but feel the intensity of his stare as they ate and laughed and talked about everything but the case. As was their custom when good food was involved, they got right to it and saved the talk of murder for after. But once the plates had been cleared and everyone had a brownie in front of them, Willard took 2, Eva turned the conversation. "Okay, everyone." She cleared her throat. "Time to get updates on everyone's missions." Jerome barely contained his laughter when she said that, and she speared him with a look. "Do you have something to share, Detective?" Everyone turned to look at him, and he held up a hand, wiping chocolate crumbs from his lips with a napkin. "No, I'm just thinking we're doing it all wrong at the station." She gave him a withering look, and he laughed again before putting his hands up to show that the floor was hers. "Why don't you go first, then, Detective, since you did come with us to meet with Willard's contact?" She was secretly hoping he'd mention information from the case that he hadn't yet revealed, but she wasn't sure he would with everyone there. To her, perhaps, but not to a table full of amateur sleuths. "Not much to tell. Henry gave us some information, namely things I'm looking into with my police connections." He said it without emphasis, which was something she appreciated. Other than that, I think the one piece of information that is most shocking is the fact that there's somewhat of a rival society that is working against the home society. While Henry wouldn't tell us in what ways exactly, I'm seeing what I can find out. Eva nodded and turned to the table. Who wants to go next? Me, Pete said. He spoke so loudly, the dog flinched from where it lay at his feet. Sorry, guess I'm excited. You went to talk to your treasure hunting friend, right? Eva said. She knew what he'd done, but since Jerome hadn't been there, she wanted to make sure it was clear. Right, and you won't believe what he found. Tell us, Geraldine said, leaning forward so far she was nearly in her brownie on her plate. The starting point. Pete looked around expectantly. No way, Elijah said, his excitement obvious by his bright smile. Yes way. Pete nearly bounced up and down in his seat. My buddy recognized the key that the map is set on. It's a whole key? Eva asked. Yep. I think that's why we were all confused. It looked like a grouping of several keys, but in reality, it's just one that's made up of several different smaller islands. Incredible, Geraldine said. He told me where it is and everything. I think he wanted to come along, but I wasn't comfortable inviting anyone. It's not my map. All eyes turned to Geraldine, and she looked almost as giddy as the rest of them, though her natural dramatic demeanor showed her attempting to stay somewhat aloof. I think it would be best if we limited the treasure hunting party to those in attendance tonight. Jerome grinned. I'm in? I suppose you must be, she said, the hint of a smile clear on her burgundy lipsticked lips. This is exciting, Kay said. It is, Eva agreed. But she was also thinking about poor Mr. Anderson. And not to get in the way of that excitement, but what happened at the antique pop-up? Oh, yes, Kay said, straightening in her seat. The dog shifted, sensing her movement, but stayed resting at their feet. It was actually really interesting. The man was back, Geraldine explained. The one I first talked to about the box. He said that he'd had a few conversations with one of those nut jobs, as he put it. Seemed to overemphasize it, if you ask me, but he did share a few details. He meant the home society people, I think, Kay added. Eva nodded, encouraging Geraldine to continue. The way he described it, I think he could have been talking about Mr. Anderson. Then again, it could have been someone else. That just proves he was there, right? Elijah said, looking between Jerome and Eva. But there's more, Geraldine said, interrupting. He said he saw another man get into a heated argument with Mr. Anderson. What? Jerome leaned forward. I asked him if he'd told the police that, but this guy seemed to have no idea that Mr. Anderson was dead. I got the feeling he doesn't work much, it being his shop and all, so I don't sense he's very hands-on. Geraldine shrugged. What did he say about the fight? Jerome asked. Not much. He wasn't close enough to hear what they were arguing about, but he could describe both men. Again, one sounded like that Mr. Anderson fellow, and the other was familiar. How so? Eva asked. I recognized the description. You did? Elijah asked. Yes. Geraldine turned to Eva. It was the same man who interrupted our conversation the other day. Eva thought back to the trip they'd taken to the antique shop and the man who had interrupted. Tide something, right? Tidewald. Francis Tidewald. He is one and the same. Geraldine looked like the cat who'd caught the mouse. Who is this Tidewald guy? Jerome asked. Apparently, he told the young man we spoke to that he was a Hemingway expert. Geraldine looked to Eva. But the owner slipped and said he was the head of the Sherlock Society. Slipped? Eva asked. Yes, it did seem odd. He looked like he wished he hadn't admitted to knowing about it, if you know what I mean. This is crazy, Willard said, rolling his eyes. I don't get it, Sarah said. The main group of treasure hunters started out as the Home Society, but one member broke off, and apparently they call themselves the Sherlock Society, Willard explained. That's confusing, Sarah said. It is. Jerome didn't look happy. So this guy, the same man who was in an argument with Mr. Anderson, has been caught in a lie and is also part of the rival society here in Key West. Looks like it, Eva said, her thoughts slipping from one clue to the next. Was it too coincidental that they were all there together at one point? Or not, because it was a local spot for treasure hunters to sell their finds or to discover antiques that had clues to the past? And why would the shop owner know about the secret society? Perhaps he dealt with them for business. What is it? Kay asked Eva, her gaze sharpening. Eva felt Jerome's eyes on her as well as the rest of the group. I'm just wondering about the muscle that Mr. Anderson was supposed to have hired. Where's he gotten to? Maybe they left, Pete suggested. Or found something else to do while they're here, Willard offered. Maybe, she admitted. She didn't have an answer, but she was curious to see what might have become of them. I'm more curious about this Mr. Tidewald and what his involvement with Mr. Anderson might have been. They didn't know where he was, Kay offered. I mean, I asked, and they said they hadn't seen him in a few days. Smart thinking, honey, Pete said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. She beamed, and that's when Vicky spoke up. We also have some news. All eyes turned to her. Sarah and I went to the coffee cabana. Jerome shot her a look. You did? Well, yes. She looked a little sheepish, but kept going. We wanted to ask around to see if anyone had come in recently to look at their tapes. Jerome frowned. Why would anyone do that? Easy, big guy, Vicky said. We were just poking around. It was crazy, Sarah said, taking over the story. I didn't think we'd get anywhere, you know? I mean, what a weird thing to ask. But one of the waitresses said they did have a guy come in the week before asking to see their security tapes. What was the reason they gave to do that? Jerome asked. She said the guy said he'd left something behind at a table, and he wanted to see if someone had picked it up. And they believed that? She said the guy was really nice. He was tall, distinguished-looking, and wore a suit. Kind of professor-like, is what she said. Eva held Geraldine's gaze, but Sarah kept talking. She said they let the guy look through some footage near the time he was supposed to be at the table, but then he said he had to have the wrong coffee shop because he didn't see himself. Said that he was embarrassed and left. So this guy got access to the cameras and was able to see every angle. Wow. Jerome shook his head. I should go talk with the shop owner. Don't bother, Vicky said with a chuckle. I talked with them and explained what a bad idea it was letting just anyone look at their security tapes. She's young, and I don't think realized what harm there could be in that. Harm indeed, Willard said as he covertly reached for the half of Geraldine's brownies still left on her plate. She swatted his hand away. She had no idea this guy was up to no good, Vicky said. So, we have a man who was in an argument with the victim, and then a man who got to see the angles of the camera and was, we assume, able to use that to his advantage in order to poison Mr. Anderson. Jerome rubbed at his chin. And they are one and the same, Eva said softly. Now everyone turned to look at her. She'd been formulating an idea since Kay and Geraldine had first shared their story. And you know that how? Jerome asked. I wouldn't say I have proof, but I'm fairly certain that once you look into the background of the founder of the Sherlock Society, you'll find that he is none other than our Hemingway expert, argumentative man, and camera inspector. All based on description. The man Geraldine and I saw was tall and distinguished, and I would say he could pass for a professor type. Agreed, Geraldine said. And if he is the same man who wanted to see the cameras, he's the killer! Pete almost shouted the words, but barely managed to contain his excitement at the last minute. Honey, Kay said, patting his arm to keep him from exploding up out of his seat. Sorry, Pete said. I just get so wrapped up in these mysteries. Everyone chuckled, but there was no hint of a smile on Jerome's face. He was clearly trying to connect the two men in real life, but there was no true connection that they knew of. Either way, Eva said, I think we must look into the man who came by to get Mr. Anderson's things, his so-called grandson. She made air quotes. And we need to figure out just who Mr. Tidewald is. I think I could handle it from here on out, Jerome said, tossing his napkin next to his plate and standing. But you've all done a great job, thanks. He turned to go, but Eva rushed after him. That's it? He paused at the top of the steps leading back into the bed and breakfast. Eva, I told you. I can't have you all doing dangerous things or working on an active case, unless I'm a private investigator. He blinked. He hadn't stated that requirement again, but she knew it was true. If she were to be a licensed PI, then she'd be able to bring her friends in on any case she was working on. Maybe not physically, but at least they could be like a think tank. But as it was, she was nothing more than an innkeeper. I'm not going to push you on this. I only suggested it because you're good at what you do. What you all do. He looked over her shoulder. But it's dangerous, and there's a lot involved with the case, especially one like this. But what about everything we've given you so far? He sighed. It's good, very helpful, but I really should take care of the rest." She nodded, understanding, though not in the mood to acquiesce. "Will you still come on the treasure hunt with us?" A grin quirked his lips, and he nodded. "How could I miss that? You can't." He left then, but she felt like there was still unfinished business. And more importantly, she had a decision to make. Would she go through with becoming a PI or not? Chapter 13. Eva enjoyed a steaming cup of coffee on the front porch of the Keys bed and breakfast. For a Monday morning, the air was quiet, almost still, and she drank in the stillness almost as much as the aroma from the coffee. Ideas had flown back and forth around the table after Jerome left, but Eva's heart hadn't been in it. Not only had Sarah said she needed to confess something to her, but Jerome wanted them to stop thinking about the case, and she wasn't sure what to do about becoming a PI or not. It seemed foolish to even think about. She was a B&B owner, a businesswoman. Sure, she'd had the desire in the past to follow after her Uncle Sal in becoming an investigator, but that was in the past. In her late 40s, it seemed like an odd time to try and start a new, or perhaps just another, career. Still, she couldn't say that she wasn't considering it. And not just so that her little club could help her solve cases, but so that she could feel as if a part of her childhood dream had come true. Was it foolish to strive after something so childish? Something so different than what she'd always known? As she took another warming sip of her coffee, pulling the light blanket up a little tighter, she caught sight of movement at the gate. The next minute she saw Sarah coming through. She was tall and lean, and now that she'd clean up, even visiting the salon Eva had told her about, Sarah's dark brown hair was cut short, which gave her an established air. It fit her. "Good morning," Eva said, so as not to startle the young woman when she came up the steps. "Oh, good morning!" She smiled brightly, a tote bag clutched under one shoulder. "I was actually hoping I might find you before work." Eva checked her watch to see that it was only a little after 7, and Sarah's shift started at 8. "Of course. Please take a seat. Or would you like to grab some coffee first?" Sarah bit her lip. "Coffee first. Of course." The young woman disappeared inside, no doubt putting her bag in the small cubby behind the desk before going to fetch coffee and perhaps a pastry from the kitchen. Eva felt at peace that morning, but that peace was threatened by her thoughts. What was it that Sarah was going to tell her? Eva had no idea. She'd had her doubts when the woman first showed up, and now she wondered if it were possible she'd been right. Did Sarah have ulterior motives for being there? Should Eva have waited to open her home, her heart, to her? The door opened and Sarah came out, another blanket in one hand and coffee in the other. "Thanks, Eva. I need this." Eva smiled, though she felt that it wasn't as genuine, clouded by her worry. "I know what you mean. This is one of my favorite spots in the mornings. Coming out here with coffee makes it that much better." Sarah took a sip, mmming her pleasure, and then turned to Eva. "Look, I'm sorry for blurting stuff out last night, at the dinner and before. You're a part of the group," Eva said, hoping again she hadn't made a wrong choice by allowing the woman into the MMBC. "It's what we do." "Right, but I think I meant more about what I said before everyone got there." Eva nodded. She wasn't sure what to say, so she masked her confusion with a sip of her coffee. "I should have told you right off the bat. I really should have, but I just couldn't make the words come out when I first saw you. And then you were so welcoming. It was a lot. Sarah, what is it? What aren't you telling me?" "It's about Uncle Sal." Eva hadn't seen that coming. He had died almost 8 years previously, not too long before her parents had died, and she'd moved down to Key West. Sarah had to have been in her late teens when it happened. "What about him?" "I was close with him, like I said. Not as close as you." She seemed to shrink in on herself, and Eva felt the need to comfort her. There was no sense getting stuck in the past, but she held her tongue, sensing that Sarah had more to say. "He was good to me, to my mom. But toward his last few years, he came around less, and when he did, it was to give my mom money." "He was taking care of her?" "In a way, yeah. But after one of those times he came by, another guy stopped by the house." Sarah shivered and pulled the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "He was a scary guy with dark eyes and a tattoo of a falcon on his shoulder. Don't know why I remember that, but I do." "What did he want?" "He wanted whatever Uncle Sal had given my mom. She refused, of course, but then he threatened me." Sarah looked off into mid-distance, and Eva could tell she was reliving a painful memory. She showed him where the money was, in a drawer, and he got so mad. Said he wasn't there for the money. She said there wasn't anything else, but he didn't believe her. He said he'd be back. What happened? Did he come back? Mom got a gun. Sarah made a face. I hated that she did, but she said we needed protection. That Sal wouldn't always be around. The guy never came back, though. I see. Eva wasn't sure why Sarah was telling her the story, but she had a feeling she wasn't done yet. It was the start of what I'd call my doubting of Sal. How so? Eva could see it pained Sarah to say as much. I knew something wasn't right. That guy who came to the house was with a gang. I found that out later. And there were just a lot of things that didn't add up. What did you do? I went to Sal's office to confront him one day. Maybe not really to confront him, but to get the full story. My mom told me not to go, but I had to know. I had to figure out what was going on. Sal was too old to be in the business anymore. My mom hadn't done work for him in a long time, and I just needed to know where he was getting the money from. And did you find him? I did. Sarah looked down. Dead. Murdered. Eva gasped. She'd heard secondhand that Sal had passed away, but he'd never mentioned any suspicious circumstances to his death. But then, why would he? Are you sure? She nodded. It was gang-related, or so the cops said. I don't know. I mean, I thought that, with the money he brought over and the scary guy, maybe it was a possibility. But he was a good man. You knew him, you know what he was like. He'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. I just can't see him getting into anything illegal. Is that what the police said had happened? They weren't really sure. There wasn't enough evidence, so they said, to link any specific gang. Just said the manner was the same. Eva didn't know much about gangs or shootings, but she had an idea of what that meant. But why was Sarah telling her all of this? It was terrible and sad, but it was in the past. Sarah, this is tragic, but just hear me out. She set her coffee down and shifted to better look at Eva. I know this is gonna sound crazy. He died almost 8 years ago, but I want to figure out what he was doing that got him killed. You think it was a case he was working? I'm almost positive it was. You see, she swallowed, looking slightly nervous. I wasn't supposed to, but I took some of the files from his desk before calling the police. You what? I know, not a smart thing to do, but I was curious. I've been curious for several years now. I worked on it when I could, but you saw my record. I was busy with other things. Everything's different now that I'm here. I feel like I can finally breathe. And she looked down. I wanted to ask you for your help. Is this what you were referring to in the emails? Sarah looked surprised that Eva had made the connection, but she had resources Sarah didn't even know about yet. Yes, but how'd you know it was me? I've got a tech guy, Eva said with a grin. As you must have too. Sarah nodded. A friend set up the supposedly secure emails. She shrugged, but didn't look unhappy that Eva had discovered their source. What's more important now, though, Eva continued, is what makes you think that you can solve anything 8 years past? I don't. Well, I didn't. But then I found the man with the tattoo. You found him? Not like in person, she was quick to amend. But I asked around before I came down here. Found out his name and things like that, and Sarah. Eva made sure her voice was gentle but firm. I appreciate that you think I'm some kind of investigator, but you are. She blinked rapidly. I mean, you're solving crimes. How is that not being like Uncle Sal was? Because I'm no professional. The thought of getting her license edged into the back of her mind, saying, yet. But she didn't know if that were true or not. And the fact that this case is over 8 years old, it's a cold case, and the MMBC really only works on current things, and... She stopped just shy of saying she wasn't sure if they'd still be able to do even that. I know, I hear you. Sarah held up a hand and nodded. She let out a breath. I know it's a long shot, and maybe we don't look into it anytime soon, but there are a few leads that I think need to be looked into. That's all I'm asking. Eva wanted to laugh and say, that's all, but she didn't. She understood what Sarah was trying to do. To her, it sounded as if the young woman wanted to right some wrongs from the past. Who was she to say no to helping her? Why don't we do this? Eva smiled gently at Sarah. Let's work on this current case, and then, in between cases, should there be more for us to look at, we can work on Sal's case, okay? Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. There were some things I left unsaid to Sal, and I feel like this would be a way of telling them to him. I understand, Eva said, and she did. There were things she'd wished she could tell her parents, but there was no going back to the past, only pressing on to the future. Here, let's go get a warm-up on our coffee and get ready for the day. You're still gonna let me work here? Eva frowned. Why wouldn't I? I don't know. Sarah picked at a loose thread from the blanket around her. Because I lied? I came here because I wanted to ask for your help, not for a job or an apartment, or I think you came because you're seeking out something you can't do on your own. I don't know if we can do it together either, but I think I'd like to get to know you better through the process. I'd like that too. I appreciate you telling me what you did. Is there anything else I should know? Sarah shook her head. Not really. I mean, I'm on my own now, and it's just his death that bothers me. I feel like I have to fix it to know what happened. I understand. And part of Eva did. A deep part she'd hidden away. But now wasn't the time to let her own thoughts be mired in the past. Come on. She tugged the woman behind her, and they went into the kitchen where Anton was preparing pancakes. He flipped one several feet above the grill, smiling back at Sarah the whole time, which made both women laugh. It was just what they needed to break the tension. That and the homemade blueberry syrup Anton had made that morning. When their pancakes were done, Eva went to Poirot and then to the desk to check her emails. Soon the door opened, and she expected to see a patron coming back from a jaunt to a local cafe or perhaps a run to the beach. But it was the same man who had come before trying to get Mr. Anderson's belongings. Hello, she said, though there was obvious ice in her tone. She wished she could call the police or signal Sarah to do so, but the young woman had stayed behind to help Anton in the kitchen since the breakfast crowd would arrive soon. I really need to get my grandfather's things. The man looked jittery, and as Eva observed him, she could see where he might be considered muscle. But who was behind this request if Mr. Anderson had hired him and now Mr. Anderson was dead? Was this some type of hyper-loyalty to the man who had hired him? I'm sorry, but... He pulled out a wallet and held up a driver's license encased in film in his wallet. Here, see? While Eva would be hard-pressed to say she understood the ways of counterfeiting, she could easily tell that his license had been fabricated. Telling him that might set him off, though, and if what Sarah said about his last visit held true, he wasn't one to shy away from violence. I see, Mr. She leaned forward. Anders? She sent him a look, but he didn't flinch. I'm sorry, but I've shipped his things back to his home. I didn't hear from you again, and... You what? Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Anton and Sarah in the doorway to the kitchen. Sarah was already on the phone. How long had they been there? I shipped them to his home. I was told a caretaker would be there to receive them. Eva hated the fact that she was lying through her teeth, but she had a feeling it was crucial for her to keep him there as long as possible, without angering him, of course. Sarah held up a hand that Eva took to mean someone was on their way. I was informed that sending them was the best way. I'm sorry. I assume you can pick them up when you go back. But where did you send them? To his home. It was becoming more and more clear that this young man had no idea who Mr. Anderson was or where he was actually from. But did he know why he was in Key West? I can't believe this. He told me to get them. If you'd just given them to me the first time I was here. He fisted his hands and slammed them knuckle down on the desk. Anton took a step forward, but she shook her head slightly. I can assure you that there wasn't much for me to send back. Just a few clothes and toiletries, nothing to warrant such feelings. You have no idea what I was looking for, so you can't tell me what was important. And what were you looking for, Mr. Anders? None of your business, lady. Now he was turning rude, but still not violent, thankfully. She caught movement to her right, and her stomach loosened the knot that her worry had forced it into. Thankfully, Jerome and Officer Kent had arrived. Jerome opened the door just as the young man stood up, turning to the door at the sound. It was clear Kent was an officer by his uniform, but Jerome looked relaxed in a pair of linen pants and a palm-front print button-up shirt. Odd. She was so used to seeing him in slacks and a dress shirt. Hello there. I hear you're bothering the owner of this fine establishment. I'm not bothering anybody. I think the lady would beg to differ. Jerome nodded to her. I'd check his license, she said, trying to ignore the dirty look the man gave her. Didn't seem right to me. Got it. Officer Kent took the man outside, but Jerome came over to her. I'm glad Sarah called. I wasn't sure how to call without sending him running. You did good. Anything I should know? I'm pretty sure the license is fake, she said, but then a thought occurred to her. And I'm wondering if perhaps he might know something more about Mr. Anderson's death. How so? He's been in here a few times looking for Mr. Anderson's things, right? Plus, he said he was told to get his belongings, as if there's someone behind all of this. I don't think there's anything of value that wasn't already taken, so it makes no sense. You mean taken by the other intruder? Yes. So there's a disconnect somewhere. They aren't working together. Yes. And I was just thinking, if he was hired by Mr. Anderson, as in he's one of the so-called muscle guys, then why would this man stick around after Mr. Anderson's death? It doesn't make any sense. You think he's working for Mr. Tywald? Jerome's gaze assessed her. I'm not sure, but I think you should be able to get it out of him if he is just a hired hand. They looked out the front window where the guy was red in the face, handcuffs rattling behind him, while Officer Kent tried to question him. I'll see what I can do. He turned to go, but Eva called out, Will you let me know what happens? Of course. He left, and she felt yet another tug to want to work more closely with him. She didn't have to have a PI license to see him, but was it wrong to think that might be a good excuse to? Chapter 14. When Jerome had called her to see if she'd come with him to the pop-up antique show in Mallory Square, she'd been surprised. She hadn't expected to hear from him that day, but she'd also not expected him to include her on the casework. And wasn't that what this was? She assumed so, seeing as how the antique fair was part of this whole thing, but then again, she was jumping to conclusions. Still, she found herself thinking about what clothes to wear and spending an extra few moments to spruce up her makeup. She met him at the curb, climbing into the seat next to him in his detective's car, a nondescript black sedan. Thanks for coming. I need someone to bounce ideas off of. She almost laughed. She knew there were plenty of other officers he could have brought with him, and yet he'd chosen to take her. Warmth spread from her stomach outward, but she tried to squash it. Time and time again, Eva had told herself that she wasn't the dating or marrying kind. It wasn't that she didn't respect couples or think that married life would be grand, but she had so much on her plate that it was intimidating, to say the least. To think of spending what little extra time she had dating someone? And marriage? How could she adjust her cozy life for a man? And yet, sitting in the seat next to Jerome with his spicy cologne swirling around her, she had to admit that a companion might be nice. Someone who complimented her abilities as she did his, and who she could see herself having intellectual conversations with, not to mention fun days at the beach. Eva. She blinked and pulled her attention from the side window back to the car's interior. Sorry, I must have been lost in thought. What were you thinking about? Nothing, she said much too quickly. She felt the blush in her cheeks and looked away again. Are you going to tell me what we're doing? I told you, I need someone to bounce ideas off of. What better place than where it all started? Or at least some of it did. They rode in silence until he parked, and then they took a pathway toward the square with the white tents flapping in the stiff breeze coming off the water. Let me lay it out and see if I've got things straight in my mind. All right, she said, amused. Geraldine came here looking for a box. No, Eva broke in. She came here looking for unique finds. She does it every year. I guess the shop owner of the stall over here, Eva pointed. He told her about the box, and I really think he sold it to her based on the fact that he claimed it was part of the Hemingway estate, and yet he had no proof. No. Did he say anything as to why he thought it was in Hemingway's possession? No. Well, not that I know of. I just assumed he says things like that to everyone. I mean, it's risky because someone could come back at you for saying something that bold, but I have a feeling he's able to read his buyers well. You think Geraldine is that gullible? I don't, but I do think Geraldine likes a good story. From what I know of the price, and the actual age of the piece, she didn't overpay by too much, and she seems happy with it. Do you think the man knew of the map inside? I don't know. I mean, if he did, why leave it in the box? Or why not bring that up when selling the item? Sounds like a good selling point to me. It does, he agreed. Another thing that trips me up, he continued, as they wound through people shopping in various stalls filled with antiques. Why was the map stolen? Eva looked over at him. Because it's valuable. Is it? She opened her mouth to say more, but then closed it. They'd have no way of knowing. You want to follow the map. His grin widened, making his eyes appear as if they were sparkling. I do. What's going on? What are you thinking? It's a theory, and I don't have it all worked out, but I think that someone besides Mr. Anderson knew about the map. Then why didn't they just buy the box? I don't know. They walked on in silence for a few minutes, and then Eva drew them toward the shop where Geraldine had gotten the box. She read the sign attached to the top of the tent, and an idea came to life in her mind. You know what? We do need to go on a treasure hunt. Wait, what just happened? What did you see? What did you figure out? I haven't figured anything out yet, but I think if we take a little trip to the key that the map indicates, we may have some sort of idea. Jerome considered her for a moment. You know I'm not going to let you keep this up. What? She asked, pulling her phone out and getting ready to call Pete. With knowing something and not telling me? She smiled. I'm not saying I know anything. I need evidence. Isn't that what you detectives are all about? He laughed at this, her desired effect, and then turned them back toward the parking lot. Well, I can't complain. This was the outcome I'd hoped for, a course of action. I just thought I would be the one at the helm. I guess there is some benefit to having you come along, Willard said. He sat at the back of the police boat, the wind whipping his white hair back and forth. You mean because we have a boat? Jerome said. Willard merely winked. I am glad you could use this. I suppose it is a little like police business, Eva said from her seat next to Jerome at the steering wheel. I do think I'll need to word the use of the boat tactfully, though. Somehow, treasure hunt doesn't really carry the full weight of what we're doing here. Or at least I hope not. Behind them, Elijah sat next to Willard, with Kay and Pete across from them. Vicky had to work, as did Sarah, and Geraldine had claimed she was too old for treasure hunts. Though, sadly, Eva had a feeling it was more due to a fear of boating than it was treasure hunting. Either way, they had a ragtag crew hopeful that they might find buried treasure. Pete had been talking non-stop about the suggestions his friend had given them for their hunt, as well as a few questions about how they'd split the money, all quickly hushed by Kay. There it is, Pete said, one version of the map in his hand as he pointed ahead of them. Oasis Key loomed in front of them, palm trees swaying in the wind and blue water sparkling between them and the key. And you checked that no one owns this? Kay asked, for which Eva thought was perhaps the 6th time. Nope, no one. How does that work? Eva mused out loud. That is, if someone wanted to buy it. I have no idea. Let's just not tell anyone where we found the treasure. Jerome turned and shot Pete a look, which at least made him appear slightly less eager to go against the law. We're cleared to look here. Not sure what happens if we do find something, but we'll deal with that if it becomes a necessity. Eva nodded her agreement, and Jerome pulled the boat in as close as they dared. Thankfully, the boat itself was shallow-bottomed, and they were able to pull in closely. Jerome dropped the anchor, and they all waded from the boat to the island. Now, Pete said, when they'd all made it ashore and were pulling their shoes back on, we need to find this location. He pointed to the map, and after a bit of discussion and consultation of compasses and GPS, they headed in the direction of the start of the map. Thankfully, it only meant walking down the beach and not through the dense vegetation. Yet. Once there, they began the dance of following the map. They'd started their day early, and it was nearing 10 o'clock when they were almost to the point of the X on the map. They had climbed through the verdant vegetation, chopping with a few machetes Jerome had thought to bring, and then they'd climbed past a waterfall, one of the most beautiful sights Eva had seen. Finally, they'd found their way to a small clearing. On the opposite side, there was supposed to be an oddly shaped tree that they were going to find something buried under. This is it! This is it! Pete was practically vibrating out of his skin, he was so excited, as they rushed across the clearing. Willard was slowing down, but Eva had to hand it to Bonnie for encouraging Willard to watch his diet. He'd kept up with them the whole time, and Eva could tell he was losing weight. While he still liked to eat, she was happy he was exercising more and that it was paying off. Do you see anything? Elijah said, trying to see around Pete where he was kneeling at the base of the tree. There was a gold plaque nailed to the trunk of the tree with a simple X engraved on it. Bold, if nothing else, Eva thought. Not yet, but... Pete grunted. How about using this? Jerome said, handing over a foldable shovel he'd brought in the small backpack he wore. Perfect. Pete went to work, but Eva stayed back. She had a hunch about what they were going to find, but the real question became how she would prove her theory. You're thinking about something, I can tell. Jerome said, coming to stand next to her as Elijah joined Pete to help pull the dirt back. I told you I have a theory, but I'm not sure how to prove it. Then tell me about it, partner. She looked up at him, an amused grin on her face, until she saw the seriousness of his expression. Don't tease me, Detective Makos. I'm still not sure I want to take the licensing course. I know, but I have a hunch about that. Let me guess. You'll tell me your hunch if I'll tell you mine. Look at that. What a smart woman you are. She made a face that turned into laughter. You know I'm smart. You don't need me spouting unprovable theories to show you that. That's just it. Maybe we can come up with a way to prove it together. Eva wasn't sure what was holding her back. She trusted Jerome, trusted his instincts. For goodness sake, he was a detective. But her hesitation had nothing to do with including him in her thought process, and everything to do with her own ego. The realization struck like lightning, and she winced, thankful when Jerome's ever-watchful gaze was focused on the digging pair instead of her. Perhaps it was growing up as an only child, or maybe she had always been like this, but she liked to figure out her own problems, do her own research, be right on her own. Was that keeping her from allowing others to help her? She knew it was. Jerome, she began, but then Pete called out, distracting them both. I've got something. He laughed in a way that made Eva think of a mad scientist. Then he and Elijah pulled out a large chest, thudding it to the ground. The two were covered in dirt, and Eva caught Kay eyeing Pete's disheveled nature with a wrinkled nose. Well, what are you waiting for? Open it, Willard said. Pete lifted the shovel to bring it down on the lock, but Elijah called out for him to stop. Wait, look here, Pete. They bent low. What is it? Kay asked. Eva stepped around as well, but couldn't see what they were looking at until the two men moved back. The lock's broken. No! Willard gasped, as if he'd seen a ghost. Pete proceeded as if he hadn't heard. He yanked the lock away, and then slowly but surely he pulled open the lid to reveal... Nothing! Willard sounded completely defeated. Eva placed her hand on his back in a comforting manner. Nothing? We came all this way for nothing? Pete slumped to the side in a pile of dirt, sweat dripping from his dirt-stained face. That is the ultimate letdown, Elijah said. When Eva looked, Jerome was looking at her. You knew. Knew what? What did you know? Pete demanded, looking up at her. She held up her hands, palms face out. I didn't know for sure, but I did have a hunch. Does that mean someone has been here before us? Elijah asked. He moved to brush hair out of his eyes and left a wide stain of dirt smeared across his forehead. I don't think so, Eva said, though she didn't elaborate. She's not going to tell us, is she? Pete asked. He looked up at Kay, who shook her head. I will when the time is right, Eva said. Then she met Jerome's gaze, as if to communicate that her silence didn't go for him. And somehow, she was fairly certain he understood what she'd said, despite the fact she'd used no words. Chapter 15. The pop-up antique show was slow the next morning. It was a weekday, and they were getting close to the end of the market. It was going to feel so empty here, Eva thought, but a part of her was glad. The show had cast a darkness to her bed and breakfast, even if inadvertently. You ready for this? Jerome said at her side. Yes. She looked ahead, not making eye contact with him, as he was pretending to peruse a stack of vintage magazine advertisements. Then let's go. She nodded once, knowing he would catch the motion in his peripheral vision. Then she stepped out from under the awning and walked back toward the tent where Geraldine had purchased her box and map in turn. It was a blustery day, the tent fabric flapping loudly, then the wind picked up even more. She clutched her tote bag closer to her and skipped ahead a few paces to reach the protection of the tent. A few people milled about, but it was much quieter than the days she'd been here before. Everything had an end time. That was something she was beginning to realize. She looked back at Jerome milling near the entrance, engrossed in a box of old baseball cards. Perhaps even her singleness had an end date. Can I help you? A voice said. She looked up and couldn't help the Cheshire grin, which she quickly tried to erase from her face. With help from both Geraldine and Henry's description, she had no doubt the man she was talking to was the exact person she needed to see. Why, I do hope so. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jerome move closer and decided to jump right in. I purchased this box a few weeks ago, and I'd like to return it. It's not worth what I paid. The man's expression soured, but he waited for her to take out the box. I see. And why is it not worth it? You'll note that it is in excellent condition and was rumored to have been Hemingway's, and just how do you know that, Mr. Simmons? His eyebrows rose, but he blustered a laugh to cover the reaction. My name is Kiski, not Simmons. I'm not so sure of that, Boyd Simmons. Eva stepped a little closer and thought she saw Jerome tense. She was going to be careful, but she wanted no mistaking what she was going to say to Mr. Simmons. You see, I own an inn in town, the Keys Bed and Breakfast, and I had a guest staying recently, a Mr. Anderson? Boyd visibly swallowed. I don't know what this has to do with... He's dead, Mr. Simmons. Dead. And what's worse, he was murdered. Boyd's arm jerked back and knocked over a small statue, the figurine shattering into 100 tiny pieces. Oh my. And the reason I'm here is because I think he recognized this box. Preposterous! I don't know. I think he did, and I think that because he was a member of your home society, Mr. Simmons. He was a member, and you are responsible for his death. Eva drew in a breath, waiting to see what Boyd would do. This was the part of her plan where things would either work out in her favor or go desperately south. She hoped for the former, but was prepared for the latter. He blinked, licked his lips, and then blurted out, I didn't do it! Now she needed to push for the truth without him realizing that's what she was doing. As if I believe that! He's dead, Mr. Simmons. Gone. His death was... Stop! I wasn't... I told him not to. Him? Who's him? Francis! Boyd was shaking now. I told him that Abe wouldn't do anything. I told him, but he was insistent. He said that something had to be done. He hired that goon trying to get at Anderson's things, but that didn't work, and the guy I hired broke in twice, and all I got was a stupid book. It meant nothing. Eva was desperately trying to make sense of the man's ramblings, but they were beginning to coalesce. You never told him you were selling off their finds, did you? Told them? Of course not. It was Francis's idea. The man slumped into an antique wooden chair, the creaking signaling its age. He started the whole feud idea. Said if members believed that there were two societies, we could bring in even more profits. You mean from selling useless treasure maps and paraphernalia? I suppose you could call it that. He looked at the box still in her hands. That was Anderson's find. He got it up at an auction in Washington, D.C. and brought it to us. We followed the map and there was treasure, but he never saw a dime of it. The man was nearly weeping now, and Eva was afraid that his testimony wouldn't stand up in a court without the presence of Jerome being announced. She knew the next thing she said was going to be crucial. Look, Mr. Simmons, you can stop this. He blinked, and a tear ran down his cheek. What do you mean? You've been taking advantage of so many people, and it has to stop. Can't you see that? It's resulted in murder, and that has to be the end of it. He blinked again. I want you to meet Jerome Makos. He's a police detective. She gestured for Jerome to come near. You need to tell him the whole truth. Boyd visibly flinched, but as if realizing how real his situation was becoming, he broke down again and began weeping. It didn't take long for Jerome to read him his rights and for a bolo to be put out for Francis Tidewald. This nightmare was soon to be over, and Eva was surprised at how thankful she was for that. Glasses clinked and laughter surrounded the table as the book club celebrated Geraldine's birthday at a small restaurant that was new to the area. Anton had recommended it, and Eva had been only too happy to give them the MMBC's business. In fact, they had booked out the whole patio, and with the twinkling lights overhead intertwined in the wisteria, it had a fairy tale effect on the setting. And the food! It was wonderful and filling with rich flavors and stunning presentation. All in all, she knew they would be coming back. Don't get the idea that all we do is eat and talk about murder, Geraldine said to Sarah, who sat to her right. The two had seemed to bond over the meal, and it made Eva's heart happy to see them getting along so well, in addition to the rest of the table. Dinner is done. Give us the update, Pete all but demanded. He softened his words with a laugh, and everyone else joined in. She had promised them she would explain what had happened at the antique market. Secretly, she'd hoped that Jerome would accept her invite to dinner and to the celebration. He'd said he was coming, but still hadn't shown up. She'd only told Vicky about her invitation, and now, looking across the table, she met her friend's gaze. She shrugged as if to say, "What can you do?" But then Vicky's gaze lifted above Eva's head, and she burst into a smile. "Jerome, you made it!" Eva turned and saw a somewhat haggard Jerome make his way toward their table. He pulled a spare chair next to Eva, and she tried, but failed, to ignore how her heart pounded in response to him sitting so close to her. Then she met his gaze. "They're demanding answers, Detective Makos." He caught her playful attitude and grinned back. "Then answers they shall have." "Yes!" Elijah's response took them all by surprise, and everyone laughed. It all started when Eva had a hunch. "What doesn't?" Willard said, almost under his breath. Geraldine hushed him, then nodded for Jerome to continue from the head of the table, as if she were the Queen of Sheba. He took her cue and jumped into how they'd found the empty chest, which wasn't news to anyone at this point, but how that had sparked some questions from Eva. Eva nodded when Jerome asked her to put it in her own words. "I kept going back to Mr. Anderson's interest in the box. It was awkward. There was interest, but something else. And when we talked to Henry, I started to see something too," Jerome continued. "It was hard for me to believe that two totally separate secret societies," he made air quotes, "could exist in the same town without being linked. We knew they were created from a past partnership, but it was Eva who suggested they could be working together to create the rivalry." "But why?" Willard asked, no doubt even more curious due to his participation in the Home Society, albeit short. "Money." Jerome said it simply, but they all knew he would explain. "You see, what Henry said was that it was a large group of treasure hunters, headed by a leader who, apparently, knew what they were doing with regard to finding treasure. But even Henry hadn't seen any profit from it, and that was the tip-off. Independently, but also together, Boyd and Francis were both working their members for treasure items that they could exploit and then resell at their antique markets. I traced Boyd's shop to different locations across the country, so we know he's crossed state lines and no doubt has unwilling participants all but handing him valuables to be resold." "But why would they do that?" The question came from Sarah. "Because they didn't know," Eva chimed in. "Remember how they said that Francis was a Hemingway expert? Jerome said there is no evidence of that in his background." "So they'd what? Get something from a member, debunk it, and then resell?" Pete asked. "Almost. But Geraldine, you're not going to like this," Jerome said with a wink. She waved him off, the hint of a blush on her wrinkled cheeks, and he continued, "In the case of the box and map, it was a real treasure map." "I knew it!" Pete said excitedly. "As far as my research goes, Mr. Anderson bought it from a Hemingway collector in D.C., brought it to Key West, one of Hemingway's most prominent locations, and then showed it to Boyd. He brought in his so-called expert, the rival leader Francis, though no one knew who he was, and then had him disprove that it was real." "But what about the treasure?" Pete asked. Kay shushed him and he grinned. "They found it. They went out to Oasis Key and dug it up, replacing it afterward so as not to make it obvious it was them. But we did find fingerprints, so it was recent." "Then he sold it," Kay said. "Yes, he sold it, map and all, in order to gain a better price. And that's when Abe Anderson caught him." "Poor Mr. Anderson," Geraldine said. "I just thought he wanted my treasure." They chuckled, but there was a somber tone about it. "So who killed him?" Elijah asked, looking around as if to ask if anyone else was thinking the same thing. "Francis," Jerome said. "He was the man arguing with him at the shop because, and we're still trying to get Boyd to confirm this, we think Mr. Anderson realized what was going on and confronted him at the antique market. That's when Francis took things into his own hands." "That's terrible," Sarah said. She looked ashen, and Eva felt bad that she was thrust into a casual discussion of someone's murder. This wasn't book club. It was real life. And while they had all been exposed to this a few times now, she hadn't. "It's okay, dear," Geraldine said, patting her shoulder as if she sensed the same thing Eva had. "We got the bad guys in the end." Sarah nodded, though Eva would talk to her later that night to make sure she really was all right. "I'm confused," Kay spoke up when it was clear Sarah didn't want the attention focused solely on her. "What about the guy who broke into Ava's B&B, or the guy who tried to get Mr. Anderson's things?" "That's also a little blurry," Jerome admitted. "But from what I can gather, Boyd and Francis both hired muscle, as Henry called it. Not Mr. Anderson." They're basically thugs for hire, and the man Boyd hired was the one who broke into Eva's place. He took the book thinking it would be helpful, but it was just a research book. The other man was hired by Francis, and he pretended to be Abe's son, but we all know how that turned out. That man turned against Francis pretty quickly. We're still looking for the other man." "What a tangled web," Geraldine said. "It was," Jerome admitted. "But you all did a great job of finding information without getting," he coughed, "too involved." They all laughed, and Eva raised her glass to toast Geraldine, effectively shifting the focus back to the birthday girl. "I'd like to say something," Geraldine said after everyone had taken a drink. "It's not often a woman of my distinguished age can boast that she has friends from all walks of life. Some young," she looked to Sarah, Elijah, and Vicky. "Some of middle age," she looked at Eva and Jerome, Kay and Pete. "And some over the hill." Now she winked at Willard, and everyone laughed. "But I can say that I have that and much more. You're all more than friends. You've become family. And what a wonderful book-reading, crime-solving family you are. To you all, cheers!" A host of cheers went up around the table, followed by clinking glasses. It was the perfect end to a tumultuous couple of weeks, and yet when Eva looked around the table, all she saw was her support network. Friends that were like family to her, just as Geraldine had said. There was nothing better for her to do with her spare time than to solve crimes with them all. Just then, Jerome's phone went off, and he looked down. Immediately, Eva could tell it wasn't a good call. "Sorry, folks, but I've got to run." He stood and looked back at Geraldine. "Happy birthday, Geraldine." She simpered under his praise and lifted a hand in a wave as they all said goodbye. "I'll walk you out," Eva said, getting up to follow him. They took the side exit to the street, and Jerome paused at his car. "Sorry I was so late, and that I'm leaving early. I thought being down here in Key West would mean less work, but it seems the last few days have been more." She chuckled. "It should quiet down soon, I'd think." "I think so." He pulled his keys out but stopped to look at her. "Thank you for your help yet again, Eva. You really are a marvel of a crime solver." She flushed, and then before she could convince herself otherwise, she blurted out, "I want to become a PI." He blinked several times, then his smile burst forth. "Really?" "Really," she said, letting out a breath and the tension that had come from holding it. "I'm probably going to need some help, but I'm your guy." She smiled again, this time more brightly, and said, "That you are." She watched him slip into his car and drive away, but the sense of peace that followed her decision couldn't be mistaken. "That's right, Uncle Sal," she said to the air around her. "I'm finally following in your footsteps." And with that, she headed back to the party.